Two men stood on top of a hill in front of a large plain, one of them holding a shovel and the other a flag. The Frontera family flag fluttered in the wind. The man with the shovel was named John, but everyone thought he was Royd Frontera, since he had found himself in another world and in someone else's body, and now he was going to do the incredible. The animals at their feet joyfully awaited this event. Royd swung the shovel like a sword, choosing the best spot. He stuffed the shovel into the ground, and the unexpected happened. The grass under his feet turned into cells of a virtual field, and this transformation began to spread further and further. The entire plain under their feet turned into virtual reality. Projections of high-rise buildings slowly began to appear out of thin air, and John remembered that in his previous life he was an ordinary civil engineer. He was going to change the world he found himself in by applying his knowledge, create a real metropolis instead of an empty plain. Royd turned to another man, who turned out to be his servant Gabriel. Happy that his capabilities were applicable in this world, he planned to make good money by building such a city. Gabriel, unable to see the projections of the metropolis, decided that his master had gone mad, since his joy was not justified by anything. John remembered how he woke up in Royd's body several years ago. He was awakened by a strange notification in a blue tablet that he had been chosen by some absolute, and could make a wish. The second notice in the blue sign, which also did not explain anything, was with congratulations. John woke up from these notifications lying in the middle of the road. The next notice, saying that he had become one of the heroes of the novel Knight of Iron and Blood, was even more strange. John, still lying on the ground, remembered that he had read this novel before he fell asleep. The next notification asked him to try harder and wished him good luck. John, who did not understand anything and was convinced that he had not drunk before, could not understand whether he was imagining it or not, and then thought in shock that maybe he had been transferred to a body from another world, as it was in the stories that he had read. He didn't really understand why he woke up when he fell to the ground, and whether he was really in another world. Having risen with difficulty, the man felt a terrible cold. While trying to say the sentence, John realized that something had happened to his mouth. A new red notification appeared in front of him, informing him that due to sleeping outside, he had developed a crooked mouth. John got angry at the notification, because he already understood what was wrong with it, and sharply brushed away the pop-up window with his hand. The man rubbed his jaw, looking around and realizing that he was definitely not in his body, but in the body of some hero from the novel The Knight of Iron and Blood, but still did not understand whose place he had taken, remembering which of the heroes was that person, that he lived in the village and could sleep on the road. Then a stranger called him by name, calling him Royd. It was a servant who had been looking for him for a long time. John saw first his sword, and then his light blue hair. In front of him was a tall, neat man in an aristocratic suit, advising him to return to the mansion, and a sign appeared from below with an inscription that the stranger's name was Gabriel Azrahan, and he was the main character of the novel Knight of Iron and Blood, which John fell into. John was surprised that the man in front of him looked exactly like the one in the novel he was reading, and he also called John Royd, which also confused him. He remembered that Gabriel, in the story of the novel, was a sword master who should become famous throughout the continent, but at the very beginning he was just a knight guarding Baron Arcos Frontera. John remembered the name of Baron Frontera's eldest son. He, John, was named Royd Fronter, after the naughty tomboy son of the Baron. From shock, he didn't even realize that he had asked it out loud. Gabriel replied that he didn't call him a tomboy. However, he confirmed that John had correctly assessed his characterization, and the blue notification sign immediately popped up mockingly confirmed that Gabriel was pleased with such a remark. Together they returned to the Frontera family estate. Gabriel, lighting a fire in the fireplace in Royd's room, where John was now to live, asked why he was lying on the road. Since the frozen John did not answer anything, Gabriel himself said that Royd had been drinking since lunch, and then broke all the dishes in the tavern. Then, missing home, he simply fell asleep on the way, which John was not surprised, because this is what all the days of this character looked like. Tomboy. Gabriel said that the Baron sent him, despite his bad son, to take care of him, because Royd could have died on the street, and even with a twisted mouth, and John noticed that he spoke without fear. That the room was very cold, and John still could not warm up, and when he touched the floor, he realized that it was icy. Gabriel decided to leave Royd to rest, saying that tomorrow he would report to the Baron about his tricks, and when he asked if the servant could not talk about his pogrom in the city, Gabriel refused. Before leaving, Royd called out to Gabriel. He wanted to know how much light there was in the house. Gabriel did not understand him, since they lived in the Middle Ages and electricity had not yet been invented. Closing the door, the servant left John alone and cold. He thought about it, because he knew all the contents of the novel. The previous evening, he had just finished reading the last chapter, and knew the fate of the hero whose body he fell into, the fate of Royd. His parents, the Baron and his wife, commit suicide at the very beginning because of the scammers who stole their fortune, and Royd starts begging and drinking non-stop. His life ends with him vomiting blood and dying. John jumped out of bed, upset by these memories, and emphatically shouted that even though he managed to become an aristocrat, his life was as worthless as the one he had in Korea in his native body. He remembered the very first notification that he had been chosen by some absolute, and he could make a wish, and wondered what this unknown person was up to and why he had put him in this body. The next morning he woke up in the same place, in the house of Baron Frontera. His mother, Maria Frontera, learned from Gabriel that Royd had broken all the dishes in the inn the previous evening. John felt awkward because he was not doing this, but reading a novel in which he was now caught up. Maria anxiously asked Royd to go and apologize. John agreed with this and was ready to apologize for Royd, which he told Maria and Gabriel. But this behavior was completely out of character for Royd, so Maria and Gabriel looked surprised, which was confirmed by the blue sign that popped up. John is outraged that they are not proud of him for such a decision, but he quietly follows to the village to fulfill his promise. A village resident was calmly putting straw into a cart on one of the streets of the village. Soon he noticed the newcomers and became afraid. John, in Royd's body, and Gabriel were walking down the street. As soon as the man saw them, he hid. John turned around, not understanding anything, but when he looked at the other residents, everyone ran away in horror and fear as soon as they noticed him. John felt confused and looked up. The boy, who looked out the window to look at him, was immediately grabbed by his mother, and the window was closed, since the woman forbade the child to look at Royd. A pop-up blue sign said that the villagers hated Royd, which he had already guessed. Royd turned to the servant, asking why he was following him, to which Gabriel replied that it was the Baron's order, as well as an order to guard. Royd was surprised when he asked who to protect him from, to which the servant replied that his task was to protect the residents from Royd. John remembered that Royd's image was very bad, and decided that he should clean it up so that by the time he started begging, like the hero in the book, the villagers would have a better opinion of him, and would give him a piece of bread. John also remembered the debts of the Royd family, because if they had not existed, he could have lived in luxury all his life. He thought that since the signs were popping up in front of him, maybe there was some kind of cheat code, and was able to call up a blue sign with the skills of his hero. The sign said that he had only 2 skills, one of which was the passive skill of a non-entity, and only allowed him to irritate others, and the second skill characterized him as an alcoholic, and when used, the hero became a dog. John clapped his hands angrily to brush away the sign that upset him, causing confusion in Gabriel, who had not seen the signs. The servant clarified where Royd was going. Gabriel reminded them that the inn where Royd had to apologize to the owner was to them, and asked if Royd had lied to his mother, to which John said that he was just thinking a little. The servant looked at the man skeptically. John began to act like a fool so as not to show that he did not recognize the area. Gabriel closed his eyes tiredly, inviting Royd to go into the inn. John excused himself and headed inside. Gabriel watched him carefully, mentally noting that since the previous day Royd had been acting strangely, as if he had become a different person. Inside the tavern, all the furniture was broken. The decorations on the walls were also affected. John sat down at the only intact table, bowed and announced his desire to apologize for what Royd had done the previous evening. The innkeeper froze, and the blue sign that appeared said that he was on alert, not knowing what to expect from Royd. He asked Royd to stop, and John thought that his words only frightened the man further due to his bad image and too polite language. John tried to change his manner of communication and apologized in a boorish manner, and then a sign popped up saying that he had used an inappropriate manner for an apologetic person. The owner hardly squeezed out the words that everything was fine and Royd need not apologize. John decided that this would be enough. She and Gabriel could return home. On the way, John shared with the servant that even after his apology, the innkeeper did not look happy. Gabriel explained to him that an apology was of little use, because all the dishes and furniture that Royd had broken were bought with the innkeeper's personal money, and if his master had compensated for the losses, the innkeeper would have been satisfied. John thought that even if he wanted to, he couldn't do this, because the family he fell into was in debt, which means he wouldn't be able to look normal in the eyes of the residents so easily, and he urgently needed to deal with his debts. The servant added that for the innkeeper, it is not only about money, because the winter is very cold, and the health of the innkeeper's mother is poor, and the pogrom organized by Royd only worsened the situation. John remembered how cold it was in the inn, because there was only one fireplace, which was difficult to heat the house with. As they walked, he thought about how it would be hard for old people to survive in such cold weather until someone comes up with a floor heating system in this world, and that thought made him stop. The idea that arose from random reflection in his head quickly became brilliant. John was still amazed, because the thought that passed through his mind was so simple and perfect. He was shocked by his own idea. In an instant, he was amazed at the ease of the solution that occurred to him. A virtual beam traced the space, creating a network of lines that formed a layout. John was mentally imagining the underfloor heating system that could be developed for the inn, because a heating system in a cold world, in his opinion, was a must-sell. The fool Royd, whose body he fell into, could not even dream of such thoughts. But for the real John it was possible and even feasible, since his specialty was civil engineer and he was good at it. In addition, while serving in the army, he had experience building a house alone. In his old world, he worked a lot on construction sites. John clenched his fist with enthusiasm and joy, as if the matter was decided, because now he knew how and with what he could earn money in this world and cover all the debts of the family of which he had become a part. He turned towards the city, telling Gabriel that they needed to return to the inn right now, and the servant turned around with incomprehension. John was unstoppable, because he was about to get his first order. As soon as the man said this, several signs appeared in front of him one after another. The first notification announced that his real journey had begun. The second said that a system of points and relationships called RP had been activated. The third said that he could receive these points when interacting with others. And the fourth reported that now the points are at 0. John looked at these notifications with surprise and bewilderment, trying to understand what they meant and how to manage the new information. John was carefully looking at the notifications, trying to figure out what the unknown RP value meant, whether it was related to experience, and whether it could be applied somehow, when another blue information sign appeared. The inscription on the sign said that he could get RP by improving relations with other main characters. When he turned to look at Gabriel, a blue sign with a characteristic began to appear above the servant's head. The symbols on the sign indicated that Gabriel's level of interest in Royd, in whose body John ended up, was -30, and John decided that since the value was negative, it probably indicated a very low indicator. John felt uncomfortable and decided to turn to the usually emotionless and reserved servant in an attempt to rectify the situation. Making a charming expression on his face in an attempt to win over the servant, John complimented him, calling him handsome, and the blue information plaque immediately correctly assessed his motives, calling this action an attempt to gain Gabriel's interest. But Gabriel remained just as cold and distant, saying that he was aware, and the information signs that appeared reported that Royd's compliment not only did not make a positive impression on Gabriel, but on the contrary, worsened his attitude towards Royd by 1 point. John, upset and disappointed, turned away from the servant and continued on his way, mentally trying to understand why his servant was so cold to him, and a simple compliment only worsened his attitude towards Royd. The guys returned to the village again, visiting the innkeeper with Royd's brilliant idea. John drew up an agreement with the innkeeper and read out its terms, pleased with how cleverly he came up with everything. He handed the contract to the man, informing him that all construction costs would be deducted from the amount of his compensation for the commotion he caused, and the innkeeper only needed to sign the document. However, when Royd looked at the man, a new blue information sign told him that the innkeeper did not trust him. John saw that the man not only didn't trust him, but was also trying to pull away using an ability called Soul Wall, which the sign told him, and the guy himself realized that he might have problems executing his plan due to the fact that no one trusted him. This upset John greatly, But he was not about to give up and ruin his grand plan from the very beginning, so he had to resort to the method that he least wanted to use, namely, using the characteristic of insignificance. Making a terribly disgusting expression on his face, he reminded the innkeeper that they would see each other often, and therefore they should trust each other. This made an incredible impression on the innkeeper, and he immediately hurried to sign the contract that lay in front of him in order to quickly get rid of the annoying aristocratic son, while the blue information plate described Royd as real trash. But John didn't care about this, because the result was achieved, and he received the first signed contract, so the guy was overcome with evil triumph, and he quickly hid the signed document in his pocket so that the innkeeper would not have time to change his mind. John finally decided to reassure the man, assuring him that he would not regret his action, and he made a good choice, to which Gabriel looked at his master doubtfully, but said nothing. When both men left the inn, the weather was beautiful outside. They stopped in the courtyard next to the inn, and John, with a shovel in his hands, mentally imagined how he would begin to implement his plan, and Gabriel watched him. The servant addressed Royd for the first time since they returned to the city. Gabriel's face expressed doubt, disapproval and dissatisfaction, as did his words asking that if Royd blackmailed the innkeeper into signing a contract, then he was up to no good again and was going to harm the people around him on a new level. John looked at the servant with skepticism, trying to understand how he came to such conclusions. He asked whether Gabriel had any logic at all, since he asked such questions, and also clarified whether the servant knew what a cognitive distortion was, and he could only ask incomprehensibly about the second part of the question. John, slightly offended, explained to the assistant that the cognitive distortion is that he expects from Royd now and in the future the same things that happened in the past, and this is caused by the fact that every brain cell is a stereotype and negative thoughts. Gabriel countered that his conclusions were not based on stereotypes and negative thoughts, but on experience and statistics. John, in turn, clarified that both experience and statistics are the past, which is what he was talking about. Gabriel had nothing to answer to this, and the servant wondered again whether Royd had been able to formulate his thoughts so competently before. And while the servant was thinking about this, a new phrase about how the innkeeper's family would smile made Gabriel look away from his thoughts and turn his attention to Royd. He had already started working with a shovel, and in response to the servant's silent question, he explained that both the innkeeper and his mother would actually laugh with joy. Royd made a new movement with the shovel, thinking about how these emotions of ordinary people would change his life as well. His new movement, filled with anticipation, was associated with the thought that these smiles could become the foundation for his income. All Royd had to do was dig, move the earth, compact it, and repeat it all over again, while his servant simply watched from a short distance. After the guy dug a small foundation, he used lumber from the mansion's warehouse, single-handedly making a wooden frame for the future house. The next step was to apply river clay, preparing the body of the house, which greatly exhausted Royd's body. John lay on the ground next to the house, wet with sweat, thinking about what a weak body he had inherited. Gabriel, examining the finished frame of the house without a roof, reported that Royd did it very quickly, but John was immediately indignant, because it took a whole week. The servant, looking at the tired master, thought incredulously that, apparently, he really planned to build what he promised and honor the concluded contract, and Gabriel did not expect this from Royd, who was always protesting work, who, moreover, had never done this before studied. John did not have time to monitor the servant's tossing, because he wanted to finish the construction of this house as quickly as possible, and he had no time left for rest, although his whole body was very sore and resisted the new loads associated with chopping wood. John, with great difficulty coping with fatigue, picked up an axe, intending to chop a piece of wood. His entire body trembled from work and tension as he swung his axe to strike. John gathered his strength, and with an exhalation was about to lower the axe onto the block to split it. But his axe hands were suddenly stopped by Gabriel's strong hand. The servant stopped the staggering tired master, preventing him from making a blow. Gabriel took the axe from John's hands to the latter's surprise, because he did not expect any action from the servant. Gabriel, meanwhile, took Royd's place, asking what needed to be done, and the man, who did not understand what was happening, explained that he needed to get boards measuring 1 span horizontally and 2 spans vertically. The swordsman threw wooden logs in front of him, as if he did this on a regular basis. Then, he grabbed the axe as if in his hand there was not a tool for construction work, but a real weapon. A series of sharp, fast, professional strikes were performed by Gabriel with lightning speed and surprise. Instead of the wooden logs thrown at the top, a hail of planks of the ideal size John needed fell onto the ground. Royd was speechless, and could only give a thumbs up. After all, he forgot that his servant is a sword master, and he does not need modern devices to do such a colossal job. Royd approached Gabriel, having plans for his servant. He stood with a shovel and asked if Gabriel, since he had mastered the tree so quickly, would like to help him with the digging. The servant was confused and upset that Royd did not even thank him for his help, but on the contrary, forced him to continue working. But then he realized that he simply forgot about the harmful nature of his master, and the blue information sign conveyed that the servant regretted helping. However, John was not going to limit himself to just one question, and approaching the servant, he began to put pressure on his sense of justice, saying that Gabriel helped him out of interest, so that Royd would not be able to deceive anyone, and the servant would be curious to see the result, and since this so, then both of them should work to quickly complete what they started and assuage the swordsman's doubts. And John, once again putting pressure on Gabriel's feelings, said that they should work together so that the servant could quickly figure out his insidious plan. Gabriel had no choice but to agree, without asking questions and leaving his master's remarks without comment, because he agreed with Royd's words mentally, realizing that for several days his master had been completely different, even though the servant could not trust him because of Royd's past. Therefore, Gabriel began to work along with Royd, because only after completing the construction would he be able to check what his master's insidious plan was. Gabriel gave it his all, wielding a shovel and digging with dedication. Royd did not lag behind him, also selflessly digging until he sweated. The shovels only managed to throw the earth beyond the boundaries of their place of work, and so Royd swung his instrument so hard over his head to lower it in front of you in the final movement. Both men stood outside the finished house, looking at the work as it finally reached its final point, with Royd celebrating with a shout of joy. John was pleased to announce to the world around him that the construction was complete. On the house in front of them there was only one hieroglyph unknown to Gabriel, and the man asked Royd what it meant, to which John replied that it was his logo. He turned to the servant with a sly grin, either asking or asserting that it was time for a check. Royd explained that it was time to check how much he had cheated the innkeeper with the agreement that Gabriel doubted. The servant only looked coldly at his master, without commenting on his question. When they called the innkeeper's family, a cold, dank wind was blowing around the house. But this did not prevent the heating system inside the house from working, nor did it prevent the logs from burning in the fireplace. The house was completely ready, heated from the outside, and a dense column of white smoke came from the chimney. Inside the house there was a very warm floor, on which the innkeeper's mother rolled joyfully, and the man himself could not get enough of the fact that he was in a warm place, not embarrassed by Royd and Gabriel looking at them. The innkeeper's mother, suffering from joint disease due to the cold, admitted that her body was fully rested on this warm floor. The innkeeper himself enthusiastically continued to feel the floor, not daring to believe that this was even possible. Royd simply watched the happy family, understanding what surprised them so much, and reasoning about it. After all, he just used a simple floor heating system, and for all the locals it was like magic. The innkeeper sincerely turned to Royd with gratitude, because he had not seen his mother smile for a very long time, and was glad that he could enjoy her joy again. Amazed by this, Gabriel remembered that at the very beginning of construction, Royd told him that the innkeeper and his mother would laugh, and these words came true. The servant continued to wonder what had happened, and why his master had changed in one morning so that now he did not recognize either the manner of speech or the expression on Royd's face. And in addition to everything, he also worked hard and fulfilled his promise to the innkeeper. Gabriel couldn't believe that Royd actually wanted to see the smiles of ordinary people, because Royd Frontera was not that kind of person. But the servant saw with his own eyes the happiness of ordinary people and how Royd devoted himself to work. I saw that the happiness of the innkeeper's family was real and was obtained not through deception, but through honest work, which made the servant himself happy with how everything turned out. 3 blue information signs immediately appeared in front of Royd, informing him that the servant's interest level had increased by 2 points, and was now -29, and for the fact that his relationship with the main character had improved, he received as much as 36 Rp. What he saw made Royd happy, because he worked well with Gabriel, and he liked the servant's company. The young master turned to the servant, asking if he still thought he was trash and insisting that he clearly did not, while Gabriel continued to claim that his opinion had not changed, but did not say it with enough confidence. Royd fell behind the servant, still smiling and assessing what was happening in his favor, because he had completed the first order, and although he was in a complete loss, it was not important at the moment. After all, the house that he built for free for the innkeeper will be his model object for advertising. And a few days later, a whole line lined up at the house. While Royd sat nearby and looked at the townspeople waiting to enter the house, a man with red hair came out of the model house, sharing his enthusiastic impression and thoughts that he thought he could melt in this house, while the queue freezing outside questioned him incredulously. Royd did not waste time, using all his charm, immediately asking the person who had come out whether he was warm, and whether he would like the same room in his house, impatiently slapping the table. Royd had a plan, and he was already showing the man who had just come out 2 options on how to do this using 2 models, the first of which was the same as the innkeeper's separate house, and model B could be the reconstruction of the entire house, and if 2 were chosen models for the client would be a 10% discount. Immediately, a blue sign appeared to remind Royd that the villager did not trust him, but this was not a problem for the guy, because he again used his insignificance ability to put pressure on the man. Royd asked if the townspeople believed him, focusing on the price, and using all his powers of persuasion when, besides the townspeople, someone else appeared nearby. These people who just arrived called out to Royd, distracting him from a profitable deal. It was Royd's father, Arcos Frontera, who was wondering what his son was doing here, and behind him stood a blond man with a large mustache. Another information sign appeared in front of the man, informing him that his father's level of interest in him was -20. Royd, upset and taken by surprise, did not expect his father's visit, because it did not bode well. The Frontera family estate was beautiful and well kept on a clear day. In the living room, at opposite ends of the long dining table, designed for a large number of eaters, there were only 2 people sitting, namely Royd and his father. Royd wasn't thrilled about having lunch alone with his father. Looking at the man opposite, he thought about how diligently he avoided him, because if he forbade his son to build, Royd did not know what he would do. Royd's father was the first to break the pause, inviting his son to speak. The man looked at John suspiciously, asking what he had come up with this time. Royd was prepared for such a question, deciding to answer quickly and clearly within the framework of boorish mode, reporting that the innkeeper placed an order for floor heating and Royd simply fulfilled it. The man could not be fooled so easily, because he already knew that his son continued to enter into agreements with other residents, which was suspicious. Arcos Frontera made a special emphasis in addressing his son on the fact that the residents were important and valuable to him, and he would not forgive if Royd lied to them or deceived them. Rod blithely continued to eat, asking his father not to worry, but he mentally noted again that once again they did not believe him. Having finished eating, Royd noted that he had nothing more to say to his father and was about to leave, mentally urging himself to run away faster. Arcos was not going to allow his son to leave so quickly, because his motives were unclear to him, and the man suggested that Royd was going to help the locals, because he learned that their family was now in a difficult situation, because Royd could not be a fool and knew how to see, and hear, and draw conclusions. The man tried to convince his son that he could handle something as trivial as their problems, and Royd should not interfere. Royd turned around thoughtfully, realizing that he had already heard exactly the same words when he was John, in his previous life. In John's home world, his real father had already told him that everything was fine and he didn't have to worry, that nothing serious was happening and he could study. And John really thought that everything was in order. But now he understood that this was a lie, and neither then, in his former life, nor now in the life of Royd Frontera and his family, nothing was in order, and Arcos was lying to him. John was not going to become pathetic because of someone's filthy money, so he wished his father not to give up, and he himself would not give up, but would try. As John left Arcos Frontier, he knew these were the words he should have told his father from his home world. But already in the corridor, Royd's thoughts returned to the orders of his models, and the guy realized that Model A had been ordered from him 32 times, and Model B 57, and he even received half the deposit, which could solve the problems with money. It was because of these thoughts that he met two strangers in the corridors of the estate. Looking at them, John remembered that they were the moneylender Mitrov and the moneylender Salo, since they coincided with the description from the novel. These arrogant men passed by without even saying hello to Royd, which offended him, because in this estate he was not the last person, but the son of a baron. John didn't immediately remember why these men were even in their estate now. At this time, in his father's office, Arkos's conversation with the guests did not promise anything good. One of the moneylenders, a thin man Salo, sat imposingly on the baron's table, asking how long Arkos would delay the payment, and the plump moneylender Mitrov reminded that more than 5 days had passed. Mitrov threatened that he and his friend would stop tolerating the baron's inaction and the fact that he continued to delay payments, making Arkos nervous. John, remembering why the moneylenders returned, opened the door to his father's office, eavesdropping on how once again the moneylender Salo was pressing his father, offering to sell items from their estate so that money would appear. John realized that he had understood everything correctly and approached his father's office on time. Royd's evil, triumphant smile said that he had planned everything perfectly. When the guy was in his room, he again called up the information sign looking at the number of his RP points, which were 36. He wondered where he could use these points gained from improving his relationship with Gabriel. Then a new blue information board suggested that he could invest these points in talents, and this would improve his abilities, which John did not expect, because all previous similar explanations were confusing. The next sign that appeared said that since Royd did not value her, she would not explain, and he had to apologize. His words were accepted by the mysterious system, and the next tablet began to load. A blue glowing circle suddenly appeared under Royd's feet. He rose up through the guy's entire body, scanning him for abilities and determining that he had various knowledge, such as soil mechanics, technology, construction equipment. Scanning it further, the system discovered knowledge such as water supply systems, design of steel and concrete structures, and the highest level of engineering. The next information board was surprised that Royd knew so much, and he wondered if she should really be evaluating him, and if this was someone alive who had a scholarship for good academic performance, and that's why she was so meticulous. The new information board stated that it was possible for John to improve his skills based on existing listed knowledge, such as surveying a base, which required 15 points, or designing a base, which also required 15 points. John carefully studied the information on the tablet, since he did not quite understand how skills improved. Since he had enough RP points for both improvements, the guy clicked on both parameters at once in the last information plate to improve both of them. A new notification with the name of the topographical survey skill, base, appeared at the same time. The guy's eyes began to glow green, causing him to scream. Looking out the window with such glowing eyes, he looked at the world. Now he had access to a topographical survey of the area, and he could not believe that this was possible without GPS, and that now he could calculate everything just by seeing it with his own eyes, because the world, while his eyes glowed with the applied skill, was outlined by a grid with dimensions. When he activated the design skill, he was able to draw house designs right in front of him, which he was very happy about, because before that he had suffered in his home world, drawing this on a piece of paper, but now he could do it in the air right in front of him. After acquiring such skills, Royd sat thoughtfully on the bed, thinking that in the future, thanks to such abilities, it would be much easier for him, but would the help of Gabriel's servant alone be enough for him? John remembered the heavy equipment that was in his home world, and was upset that he did not have the ability to summon such here. Then, in response to his thoughts, another blue sign appeared, informing him that there was something in this world for summoning, which made John happy. A new information sign appeared in front of his face, causing surprise. The information on it said that in this world he had access to a random choice of phantom. Through the use of RP points, he could summon phantoms with different capabilities and different skills, and such a phantom partner would try for him in everything that John considered advertising games. Having once again carefully studied the sign, the guy still had questions when additional lines with information appeared at the bottom. The new part of the sign said that randomly selecting a phantom cost 50 RP points, and he could start right away. Royd was upset that he couldn't start now, because he had no points left. The guy wondered what the word phantom could mean in this world, because usually this could characterize huge animals of different sizes, whose strength could be equal to heavy equipment. Then Royd realized that he needed more RP points to be able to take advantage of this, and then he left the room to return to his father's office, gain the interest of the main characters and earn the missing RP. And so one of the moneylenders began to threaten his father, slamming his hand on the table. It was the fat man Mitrov, who stated that since Arcos did not have a penny, he could suggest a way. The moneylender smiled frighteningly, advising him to sell his wife and children to Arcos, which would allow the Baron to get good money. Royd's father, amazed by what was said, angrily stood up from his seat. Arcos was clearly going to answer him with something else, but Royd, with a sack on his shoulder, interrupted their conversation by entering the room and putting his hand on Mitrov's shoulder in a friendly manner, reminding him that even if the guests are creditors, they are obliged to maintain the bounds of decency. The moneylender Mitrov jumped away from the guy who suddenly appeared, asking who he was. Arcos called his son by name, and the fat moneylender remembered Royd as the eldest naughty son, pointing out that it was clearly because of his bad manners that he interfered in the conversation of adults. Mitrov began to threaten Royd, trying to drive him out of the office, to which Royd intercepted the conversation, asking the moneylenders to show the invitation letter. Both moneylenders stared blankly at the guy, not understanding what he asked. Then Royd quoted the fundamental law of the kingdom, more precisely, Chapter 6, Article 3, which stated that all the aristocracy are subjects of the king and have the right to defend their interests. The guy looked sternly and warningly at the moneylenders, informing them that entering the residence of the aristocracy, which is their estate, without an invitation letter is considered an intrusion, and this is contained in the law of the kingdom. Both moneylenders began to shout with one voice that Royd was talking nonsense, and they had never heard such a law. John acted like a fool and suggested checking the existence of such a law. He called loudly to his servant Gabriel, since he had left the door unlocked, and he should have heard it. The sword servant actually appeared immediately, informing Royd that he was nearby. Gabriel entered the Baron's office calmly and confidently, not surprised by the guests. John was determined. He smiled frighteningly when the servant entered, and ordered him to cut off the hand of one of the intruders. The moneylenders immediately became nervous, shouting that Royd had gone crazy and clearly wanted to sue them. John only grinned at such accusations and suggested that the moneylenders again check whether the law he referred to exists. He suggested that the moneylenders find out which side the court would take, while Gabriel drew his sword. The moneylenders were horrified that the swordsman was going to carry out the order of the Baron's son. They rushed out of the office, threatening Royd with future problems, promising that he would regret it. Very quickly they disappeared from Arcos's office, and only the slamming door indicated that they had even been here a second ago. Royd was pleased with himself as he saw off the escapees with a comment about how insignificant they were. Only his father did not share his son's satisfaction, turning to him and the servant who came. Arcos was desperately furious at his son's prank, sure that they did not understand what they had done, because, in his opinion, now there was a situation where they had to be on their knees and beg the moneylenders. But Royd did not pay attention to his father's words. With a loud thud he lowered the bag that he had been holding over his shoulders onto the table in front of the man. He smiled, telling the Baron that at first he wanted to receive the entire deposit from the villagers and then give it to his father, but he changed his mind and gives what he already has so that his father will pay this month's interest. Arcos looked in disbelief at the bag containing the gold, clarifying that his son had collected money from the villagers, obtained in a dubious manner. Gabriel entered the dialogue unexpectedly, siding with Royd and asking the Baron not to worry. The servant promised that he would ensure that Royd fulfilled the terms of the contract. Arcos, looking closely at the servant, came to the conclusion that Gabriel looked as if he completely trusted Royd's words. Royd smiled, bowed to his father, as did Gabriel, and said that since he didn't mind the money, they would go. The sound of both men's footsteps echoed in the corridor. Gabriel was the first to start a dialogue, asking how Royd knew such laws, because the servant was sure that he was a fool, to which the embarrassed John replied that he simply heard it somewhere. Mentally, he himself remembered how he learned about this in the novel, after the Baron and his wife committed suicide. The same moneylenders that the Baron now had, after his death, wanted to dig up the body of Arcos and his wife and sell it. And then Gabriel himself uttered words about the fundamental law of the kingdom, its 3rd chapter, 6th article, that all the aristocracy were subjects of the king and had the right to defend their interests, which John now took advantage of. In the novel, Gabriel spoke these words before he cut the necks of the moneylenders, and then in court the servant was acquitted. Royd once again thought that he had a huge advantage, such as knowledge of the content of the novel into the world of which he found himself. Pensive Royd not only remembered the contents of the novel, but also understood that a notification was due to arrive any moment now. And then several information signs appeared saying that the interest of Royd's father, Baron Arcos, has increased by 6 values. And since Royd has improved his relationship with the main character, he receives 60 RP, and his current amount of RP is 61. John smiled triumphantly, because everything happened as he planned, and now he will be able to activate the phantom. On a moonlit night, it was quiet and calm near the estate. John walked out onto the training ground alone, intent on putting his skills to the test now. He turned around, making sure no one was around before he started. Calling up the blue navigation sign in front of him, he selected the skill of freely drawing fantastic creatures. The inscription at the bottom of the sign said that the cost of activating this ability was 50 RP, and John pressed the start button. A bright neon green light immediately lit up somewhere in the sky above Royd. The sign disappeared, and in front of him the guy saw several virtual gears that began to spin quickly. These gears moved bizarrely in the sky above Royd. The guy watched their movement in shock, assuming that this is how magic works. Finally the gears came together into one big virtual seal. True, as soon as the drawing was completed, the seal shrank to the size of a human head and stopped in front of the disappointed Royd, because the guy decided that since the seal was so small, the spell was somehow weak. Nothing else happened to the seal, and strange, incomprehensible sounds were simply heard from its depths, until something inside it began to glow brightly. After a couple of moments, a small animal similar to a hamster crawled out from the center of the small virtual seal. Royd watched this in confusion and upset, because the guy was counting on a large phantom. The hamster fell at Royd's feet, falling on his stomach. He quickly stood up and joyfully looked at the guy with his small eyes. Royd looked at the animal at his feet with incomprehension, unable to find words to express his reaction. The guy looked at the animal contemptuously, concluding that something had gone wrong with the spell, since there was such a small creature in front of him. This reaction upset the hamster, and his eyes filled with tears. He began shouting an incomprehensible word padong, which did not add clarity to Royd, because he did not understand what this small animal could do. The guy asked the animal what he could do, because the ability to shoot acorns would not be useful to him, and what else the hamster was capable of, Royd did not know, which he asked the animal again. The hamster began to live intensely for something, and his big cheeks were swollen. There was something in his mouth. Soon the animal spat out 2 pieces of paper, arousing Royd's disgusted curiosity. The guy squatted down, picking up and opening sheets of paper, reading on one that it was the Manual of Padong, which was the name of the hamster in this world. The instructions stated that Padong was a cute hamster, and should be cared for with love. The second bag contained sunflower seeds that should be fed to the Padong, and some of them could change the structure of the hamster. The instructions stated that the red sunflower seed made the Padong grow huge, but the effect would wear off after 12 hours. The blue sunflower seed makes the Padong small, and should be fed to it before the effect of the red seed ends. Royd also read in the instructions that a set of 2 seeds will cost 1 RP point. The guy looked at the animal with a question, thinking out loud about how big this animal could grow, whether it was only the size of a person or more, to which Padong, shouting out his name, advised Royd to check for himself. Royd, remembering that hamsters drip well, decided that the Padong could be useful, even if it became only the size of a person, so he fed the animal a red seed. Padong happily accepted the treat, instantly eating the offered seed. The transformation of the animal began immediately, and right before Royd's eyes, the Padong began to rapidly increase in size. And the Padong did it so quickly that Royd did not have time to dodge, and was knocked down by the animal. Since the hamster's transformation was very fast, the impact on Royd was so strong that he was sent flying several meters away. Stopping on the ground, the guy looked in shock at the huge beast. In front of him there was no longer a small hamster, but a 5-meter or even 10-meter long phantom Padong. The huge hamster looked down on Royd, hoping that his owner was now pleased with his size. The blue information plate characterizing the animal said that the Padang had the first-level digging skill. Confirming this, the animal immediately dug a huge trench in the ground with lightning speed. The next information board reported that the Padang had a level 1 ground fortification skill. Joyfully shouting his name, the huge hamster rolled along the dug trench, strengthening it with the strength of his large body. The new information board talked about the first level of puffing out the cheeks as another Padang skill. The animal stopped and puffed out its huge cheeks, showing how it could. It turned out that he had a lump of earth in his mouth, which he immediately spat out in front of Royd. A huge compressed lump, abundantly covered with saliva so that it stained everything around, fell to the ground in front of the guy. Royd, not at all embarrassed by the abundance of the Padang's saliva on the clod of earth that splattered him from head to toe, happily watched what was happening, because the Padang could solve all his problems with heavy equipment. Already returning to his room along the corridors of the estate, Royd was thinking about how best to tell others about the Padang, and was worried whether people would worry about the animal. He came up with the idea of simply carrying a summoning book with him and telling everyone around him that he was a brilliant summoner. And reassured by this thought, the guy sped up quite quickly. Quickly leaving for his place, he was already thinking about how to solve the problem with workers for the large-scale construction project that Royd had started. The earlier morning didn't take long to arrive. The weather was beautiful in the area around the village and estate. Royd gathered a group of identically dressed men in front of him and handed out shovels to everyone, beginning the briefing and ordering everyone to repeat important rules after him. First of all, he communicated that safety comes first, shouting it so that everyone can hear. In front of him stood the army of the Frontera barony, consisting of 30 people who did not really understand what Royd was talking about, yawning sleepily and asking again. Royd had to fight not to laugh as the soldiers in front of him answered inappropriately, as if they weren't being paid, and then Royd wondered, since his father had so many debts, why they were still maintaining these soldiers instead of disbanding them home. The guy thought that since they were so lazily obeying his words, and the Baron's financial situation was bad, he would not give these guys overtime bonuses, and since they were idle anyway, they could become an excellent workforce. Royd addressed the soldiers again, urging them to listen to him carefully, and reminding them that they were all soldiers, and together they were an army. He recalled that the essence of the army is to complete assigned tasks, while at the same time recalling his past, and his service in the army of his home world, where they spent more time digging and weeding than actually training. Royd provided the guys with a mountain of earth, saying that he dug it out, working all night. He kept silent about the fact that it was the merit of the Padang that he managed it in half an hour, because this did not concern the soldiers. He turned to the guys, explaining that their primary task was to revive the estate, and they would implement his new project, and the soldiers needed to move this land to the construction site. Such a command did not generate support among the soldiers, who clearly did not want to work. Royd assumed that these people would react this way, but that was not the main problem. The guy was approached by someone who had just approached. It was the blonde man who, along with Royd's father, visited him in the village during the presentation of model houses to the locals, and it was the senior knight of the Frontera barony, Newman, who wondered what Royd had ordered his people to do. But Royd was not surprised, because he had been waiting for the moment when Newman would speak. There were 3 knights in the Frontera estate, and the eldest of them was Newman, to whom Byron and the main character of the novel, Xavier Gabriel Azrahan, were subordinate. And now, standing next to Newman, John recalled that at the beginning of the novel, only Gabriel Byron and Xavier Arakan remained loyal to his family until the fall of the estate. And Newman was the first to betray and abandon the Baron, because it was he who sold information about the Baron to scammers. Royd looked at Newman with a look of contempt and incomprehension, wondering how such a disgusting person could be the senior knight of the estate. Pulling himself together, the boy slung the shovel over his shoulder, turning to Knight Newman and asking what he thought they were doing. The knight continued to glare at Royd, replying that he could not believe that the Baron's son would force the militia to do his dirty work, and he, as the head of the knights, could not tolerate such a thing. Royd could only mentally roll his eyes at the nonsense that the knight was saying, because he was earning money to pay off his family's debts. But out loud the guy only said that he had the Baron's permission. Newman, of course, did not believe in Royd's positive intentions, suspecting that he had somehow outwitted the Lord, and decided to remember the past of the Baron's young son. The knight assumed that Royd's intentions were selfish, and that he was using the militia for personal gain. Looking at the serene guy, Newman asked whether he was right or wrong. Royd confirmed with a calm smile that the knight was right, and then, with a serious, threatening face, he added that Newman would now receive a blow with a shovel. The knight in front of him clearly did not expect such pressure, because his endurance was weak, and his emotions expressed fear, and Royd noticed that in an online game, if Newman had ever played them, his endurance would not have been enough for a real fight. Royd sharply stuck the shovel into the ground, scooping up part of it. Swinging, he threw sand in the knight's face, catching him by surprise. The guys from the militia watched what was happening in shock, clearly not expecting such a turn. Newman only managed to shield his hand from some of the lumps. Royd smiled smugly, because his prank was a success and the knight was frightened by his unexpected action. Newman stood covered in sand, dirty and humiliated. His face showed anger and indignation, and he turned to Royd, calling him a scoundrel, and asking if he was trying to tarnish his reputation, mentally cursing the stupid son of a bankrupt baron. But Royd was not to be swayed, because this is exactly what he wanted, goading the knight and asking if he wanted to throw away his regalia and fight. The guy masterfully twirled the shovel in his hands, as if it were a weapon. Stopping her right in front of the knight's face, Royd challenged him. The guy asked with a grin if the knight was ready to try to fight him and have a duel. The angry knight was in the highest stage of anger, reporting that Royd would regret this, clearly accepting his challenge. Gabriel, who learned about Royd's idea already at the estate, clarified whether he really intended to duel with Knight Newman in a month. The servant looked at the young master doubtfully, asking if he was confident in his victory. Royd, in his usual manner, began to copy the fool, at first denying the victory. He honestly admitted that he was just a lazy person, while his opponent was a knight who was called both a man of heart and a junior sword expert. And how would Royd be able to fight him? And clearly Gabriel asked this without thinking, but finally, Royd asked whether his servant could think at all, which clearly offended him. Gabriel had to try very hard not to grab his sword at that very moment. The servant looked at the mentally retarded-looking master, clearly not believing that he could suddenly throw dirt at Knight Newman, and even challenge him to a duel, assuming that Royd wanted to be a scoundrel again, like before. Gabriel doubted that such an act by Royd could be connected with the idea of earning money, because he himself asked the Baron for a favor, and removed Gabriel from the conversation, and appointed the Knight Bayern as a temporary manager, while he himself led a detachment of builders. The servant could not believe that Royd was not confident in this duel, and could not decide how to feel about it. And because he continued to pretend to be carefree and pick his nose, Gabriel wanted to kill him. Wiping his hands and interrupting his servant's thrashing, Royd turned to Gabriel, as Knight Xavier, with a request to do something for him. The young master again made a fool's face and nonchalantly asked the servant to teach him how to use a sword. Gabriel looked at the guy in front of him and replied that he didn't want to do this. Royd made a disappointed and upset face, still copying the fool and asking why. And the servant replied that the first reason was that his duty was to keep Royd safe. Gabriel then looked at the guy in front of him appraisingly, adding that the second reason was that Royd was like a sack, in the sense that if the sack was taught fencing, what would be even more dangerous to be near him, which Royd was offended by, and asked the servant speak more softly. And when Gabriel turned his gaze back to the master, he again clarified whether these were all the reasons why he did not want to teach him. After all, Royd had a plan and something to offer Gabriel, and he asked if the servant would agree to teach him fencing if he could deal with his insomnia in return. Gabriel swallowed, caught off guard that Royd was aware of his weakness. Royd enjoyed the surprise effect, remembering that he knew it because it was in the novel he was reading, and he also knew not only about insomnia, but also about its cause. In the novel Knight of Iron and Blood, knights were divided by rank into 4 levels. The very first was the junior sword expert, the next was the intermediate sword expert, followed by the supreme sword expert, and the last was the sword master level. Xavier's level was the highest sword master, and he would soon reach the last level, and the reason for his insomnia was Gabriel's inhuman nerves, which were too sensitive. This was called the sword master syndrome, and Royd understood that not only did they know about it in the rural areas where they were, but Gabriel himself had no idea about it, so he again clarified whether the knight in front of him would agree to such a deal, and in order to put pressure, Royd said that Xavier should not pretend that he does not know about any insomnia, pressing on the fact that his lack of sleep was written on his face. Gabriel breathed a sigh of relief, relaxing slightly after Royd explained everything. He looked doomedly at the young master and reluctantly agreed to try to teach him, to which Royd immediately did not believe him and asked him not to give in to him. Gabriel smiled smugly, saying that he simply did not believe that Royd could cure his insomnia and would most likely fail, because the servant had tried many things to cope with it, ranging from cognitive behavioral treatment, herbal remedies, aromatherapy, special exercises, oriental medicine and things like that. However, Royd's method worked. Parr and Gabriel very quickly fell asleep on the rocking chair, hugging a pillow. The guy stood nearby smugly, admiring the result of his work and quietly telling himself that everything that Gabriel listed was nonsense, and he knew exactly how to cure the servant's insomnia. Royd remembered that in the book, Gabriel accidentally fell asleep for the first time while studying magical techniques, so he himself took a similar approach, reading the 18th magical technique to the servant about a manual on reinforced concrete structures. Grinning gloatingly, Royd triumphed, mentally rejoicing that since he succeeded, now all the skills of a swordsman will go to him. Their first training session began early in the morning. A perfect-looking Gabriel announced the first exercise, telling Royd to run 50 laps. Royd calmly looked at the servant and turned to proceed. Gabriel looked at him in surprise, mentally surprised that he ran without complaining. Royd, meanwhile, ran the first lap, and as he ran past Gabriel, he began to whine miserably, saying that he wanted him to teach him something. However, he did not stop and ran further, and when he ran past the servant, he sarcastically asked whether he expected Royd to run at all, and probably thought that he would whine. After the next circle, Royd continued that then Gabriel would have said that the master simply could not do this, and would have brushed him off. Since Royd, with his words, got right into Gabriel's thoughts, he stood amazed. Running further, the guy shouted to the servant that he should figure out what he would do next, because Royd was going to run to the end. The blue information sign that appeared in front of him informed Royd that his passive skill of ugliness had been increased to the 4th level, and now everyone who sees him would mistake him for an abnormal person and would feel the urge to punch him. To which the guy was indignant that he had there is no such skill in wishing the notification to disappear. Each step was not as easy for Royd as it might seem, and mentally the guy already admitted that he was tired, and to say otherwise would not be true. Moreover, such a life was nothing in comparison with his memories of life in the real world, where he did not have a family that could give him warmth. Every morning he opened his eyes in a crowded dormitory. Every day he carried bricks on his back to the 4th floor of the villa. Every night he worked as a loader, loading trucks with boxes just to avoid starvation, living with the hope that one day things would get better. He encouraged himself to hold on, John, because one day he would get better, hoping for light at the end of his dark tunnel of life. He encouraged himself that he was doing well and being qualified, mentally reaching out to a brighter future. I believed that there was only a little time left before this hope arrived. I believed to the last, but the hope was not justified, and the bright future moved further and further away from him, and in the end he was left alone in pitch darkness. Therefore, in comparison with those oppressive feelings of real life, that pain and despair, Gabriel's training, his suffering right now was nothing, and Royd ran the next lap, assigned by Gabriel, without whining or giving up. Gabriel, looking at how he was driving himself to exhaustion, sincerely dedicating himself to training, decided that he would help the young master and teach him his fencing technique. A new series of blue information signs informed Royd that Xavier's opinion of him had improved by 1 point, and was now -28, and for this slight improvement in his relationship with the key character, he received 18 RP points, and now his RP score was 29 RP points. At this time, at night, an important conversation between Newman and Baron Frontera took place on the estate. Royd's father could not understand how his son could be so rude to Newman, who had protected their family for 5 generations. The Baron was upset by the news of the duel, because he thought that Royd had come to his senses, but after this news he thought that he apparently misunderstood his son's motives. However, the father informed the knight that his moral duty required him not to interfere with the duel, but he could not help but ask the knight, since his son was the heir to the estate, not to be too cruel to Royd. The Baron asked the knight not to maim his son, but simply to bring him to his senses with this duel. Newman bowed his head obediently, saying that he accepted his master's request. But Newman was not honest with the Baron, because in his mind he was already wondering whether he could and would want to do this during a duel. Walking angrily through the corridors of the estate, Newman, on the contrary, mentally imagined how he would beat the arrogant scoundrel Royd, and then simply kill him. The knight also decided that if the Baron made a scandal out of this, that Newman would also kill him along with the Baroness, and then pass it off as suicide, and then, as he had long planned, he would leave this village for a better place. Newman mentally rejoiced that thanks to this trick of the young scoundrel, these events would happen much faster than the knight expected, which made him very happy. A month passed and the day of the duel between Newman and Royd arrived. A lot of people gathered around the training field, and Newman with a sword and Royd with a shovel stood in the center. Sitting on the podium, Royd's parents and two knights waited with bated breath for the upcoming fight. Newman unfastened his sword and scabbard from his belt, grabbing it for convenience, and turned to Royd, asking if he was ready. Royd kicked the edge of the heavy metal shovel and threw it over his shoulders, answering with a smile that he was ready. The young gentleman was full of confidence and self-satisfaction, saying that Newman should prepare to receive a shovel. The crowd of spectators looked at Royd in surprise, not understanding why he chose a shovel, not believing that he seriously decided to fight Knight Newman with a shovel. Newman himself looked back with displeasure, humiliatingly assessing the shovel in the hands of his opponent. Gabriel, standing on the podium with Royd's parents, also looked at the young master's shovel, remembering that it was made of metal and Royd ordered it from a blacksmith. Royd's father, meanwhile, lamented that his son was an idiot, suggesting that for him it could all seem like some kind of joke. Gabriel wondered if Royd could really take everything as a joke, and came to the conclusion that he couldn't, remembering what his master had been doing for the last month. The servant saw Royd strenuously doing general exercises early in the morning. During the day, his master went to the construction site to explain to the village engineers about the boiler room. In the evening, Royd returned to Gabriel, and they trained with the sword until the guy wanted to sleep. After analyzing all this, the swordsman decided that his master did not seem like a man who was just joking, and Gabriel was sure that Royd was serious. Royd's father raised his hand, calling everyone to silence, and announced that the duel between Royd Frontera and Knight Newman would begin right now. Newman thrust his sword forward, taking a fighting stance. Royd grabbed the shovel with both hands and also took a stance. Only she didn't look serious at all. Gabriel watched this in amazement, complaining that his master had taken such a stupid pose, not at all like a fighting one. Newman attacked with the first sharp swing of his sword, aloud indignant that Royd had mocked him with such neglect in the duel. Royd was completely focused on the fight, holding the shovel tightly in front of him. He confidently repulsed the knight's attack, standing still. Gabriel and Baron Frontera watched the fight in surprise. Newman thought Royd had just gotten lucky as he swung for his second strike. But the Baron's son not only did not suffer from this blow, but also repelled it with his shovel, redirecting the knight's sword in the other direction. Gabriel watched his master's movements in amazement, realizing that he had just used an incredibly effective technique, using a special technique that is used in real battles, and the servant could only note in amazement that this was evidence of a sharp improvement in Royd's sword skills after so many years of no progress. Royd, meanwhile, again pointed the shovel at Newman, who was surprised by his speed. Mentally, the guy laughed at the confusion of the knight in front of him, remembering that in his native country every man could handle a shovel like that. Royd remembered his real life, where he was trained during his military service in this modern hand-to-hand combat technique called the bayonet charge. Returning to the battle, the guy mentally reminded himself that the shovel in his hands can do a lot, making another lunge towards the knight who barely had time to dodge with a shameful cry. Royd used his weapon not only as an attack weapon, but also as a shield, deflecting blows from Newman's sword. Another attack from Royd, which he called the power of cutting off roots, and the shovel passed very close to the knight, who barely managed to dodge again. A sudden thought that visited the Baron's son forced him to stick a shovel into the ground and do something that no one expected from him. The guy stood on the shovel with both feet and, springing, began to jump on it with a mad scream, disorienting his opponent. Gabriel, who was sincerely worried about Royd, fearfully thought that his master was joking again. But Royd had no time for jokes, because he was about to attack. Gabriel, appreciating his concentrated and satisfied face, once again began to doubt his master's motives. At that moment, Newman, with a victorious cry, rushed with his whole body to attack his opponent. Royd was ready for such a turn, because the shovel was only the first weapon that the guy prepared to beat his opponent. Royd's second weapon was the basics of fencing, which he learned from Xavier, and using them, the guy carried out a series of attacks, forcing his opponent to retreat. Amazed by the speed and force of the Baron's son's blows, Newman began to doubt that he had correctly assessed his opponent, because Royd had always been a drunkard and a scumbag, and the knight could not understand when he became so strong. Royd used the third weapon that he prepared for this duel with Newman. It was a synchronized skill in handling tools, or rather digging of the first level, which allowed him to become one with the shovel in soul and body, thanks to which the level of synchronization between him and the shovel only grew. He swung his shovel, which glowed green with the skill activation, preparing to strike. Royd remembered how he was able to get RP points for this, because his training increased Gabriel's opinion of him by a full point. In addition, the Baron and Baroness, who for the first time in their lives saw the sincerity of their son, also improved their opinion of him by 2 and 3 points, respectively. Therefore, he was able to accumulate 97 RP points, and the blue information sign suggested that he learn the additional digging skill, which cost only 40 RP points. When Royd agreed and mastered this skill, he realized that he was quite cool, and now, during the battle, he competently used it to confront the knight. Newman was exhausted because Royd was too good at countering him. The knight concentrated, swinging his sword, mentally deciding that he had no choice, because he was going to use a technique that was not usually used against ordinary people. He clenched his sword, activating the special skill he was going to use to defeat Royd. Gabriel, who noticed this, only narrowed his eyes slightly, clearly not expecting this from the knight, but without looking frightened. The power of the skill, called mana, began to concentrate in Newman's body. It flowed from his arms and legs to the center of his chest, twisting into a spiral in the area of his heart. Royd, ready for anything, realized what was happening, because his opponent was pumping up with mana. The guy knew that this skill was called a mana heart, and Newman was clearly going to use it against him. The knight stood up and raised his sword in front of him. He looked menacingly at the Baron's son, saying that everything was serious now, and called his opponent a bastard. Royd remained silent, only clutching the shovel tighter and not showing fear. Newman swung and rushed towards him, intending to deliver a crushing blow. Gabriel carefully watched the unfolding battle, mentally analyzing that Royd, who had no talent for 10 years, would have needed at least 5 years to master such a technique as the Heart of Mana, and it was unlikely that he would be able to block such an attack now. Royd, meanwhile, calmly remained standing in place, ready for the knight to strike. He just raised his weapon in front of him, either intending to repel the attack, or intending to use the shovel as a shield. Newman mentally triumphed, considering him an idiot, planning with his blow not only to cut the shovel, but also to pierce the guy's skull. Royd's mother, Maria, covered her mouth with her hands in fear, holding back a scream, and his father rose from his seat, worried about his son. Knight Newman's crushing blow struck the core of the shovel. But what the knight expected did not happen, and the shovel survived. On the contrary, instead of the effective defeat, Newman felt that all his strength seemed to begin to flow away. Royd smiled maliciously, mentally remembering the fourth weapon, which was the skill that the guy prepared specifically for the duel with the knight. Gabriel calmly continued to watch the duel, while Royd recalled that it was thanks to the servant that he was able to master the skill of mana, because it was this skill that made Xavier the strongest man in the novel. This was Azrakan's core technique, which, when used, could transfer mana from one opponent to another during a fight. Newman pulled back his sword, retreating and exclaiming in horror that his mana had been drained. Royd did not wait for his opponent to come to his senses and swung for another blow. He hit Newman with a shovel right in the face with all his might. The knight only saw the tooth fly over him against the blue sky. I saw it, but because of the blow I didn't immediately realize that it was his tooth. Royd, again preventing Newman from coming to his senses, hit him in the jaw with the handle of a shovel, and he swung for the next finishing blow from top to bottom. His shovel hit Newman squarely on the back of the head, knocking out any hope of victory. With a loud sound, The knight fell to the ground like a bag of sand. The public, shocked by such a turn, was surprised to not understand what had happened. Royd's father also did not expect this, because he was sure that Newman's blow would kill his son, but Gabriel was calm. The spectators began to whisper in bewilderment, not believing that the young master had won, because it seemed to them nonsense and a very strange coincidence of circumstances. Baron Frontera, with slight hesitations and pauses, slowly and loudly announced that his son, Royd Frontera, had won the duel. Newman, who was lying defeated on the ground, could not believe the Baron's words, not believing that a sword master like him could lose to such scum as Royd. The young gentleman approached his opponent, who was lying on the ground, clarifying whether Newman had heard this exactly, repeating that he had won the duel. Royd looked down on his opponent, proudly throwing a shovel over his shoulder, reminding him that he had been beaten with a shovel, and the guy was not going to stop there, swinging again and informing Newman that now the long-awaited punishment awaits him. The shocked toothless knight looked with fear at his victorious opponent. Royd's father, seeing that his son, despite the end of the duel, was again swinging the shovel, as if about to hit the knight lying on the ground, shouted that the duel was already over, not realizing with horror what Royd was going to do to him. The guy, as if maddened by adrenaline and the fight, showered Newman, who was crouched in a protective position, with a hail of shovel blows. The Baron, angry and horrified, shouted his son's name again in an attempt to stop him. The two soldiers had difficulty restraining the incensed Royd, asking him to stop and reminding him that the duel was already over, while the young master himself was going to continue beating the knight with a shovel. Royd's father looked blankly at the unfolding events, asking either Gabriel or himself if his son had gone crazy. Gabriel looked at his master doubtfully, wondering a similar question about whether his master had lost his mind. Royd, having once again calmed down, waved the soldiers aside, ordering them to let him go. He sighed wearily, looking at the crouched knight at his feet. Only this was a diversionary maneuver, since the soldiers near Royd relaxed and lost their vigilance. He again began swinging the shovel and hitting the knight in front of him. Gabriel, watching this carefully, noticed the smallest details. The servant noticed that Royd was hitting the knight in front of him so as not to injure him too much. Royd's face remained calm and focused, as if he knew what was coming next. Gabriel thought that this was the look of a man who knew exactly what would happen next, and seemed to know everything that could happen. The servant remembered the events that unfolded 15 days before the duel, during one of their night training sessions, when Royd asked him to teach the Azrahan Mayan technique. Gabriel was surprised by such a request, and Royd had to persuade him, reminding him that it was not something bad. The young master himself clarified that this technique, in addition to the acquired mana, allows its owner to attract mana from the surrounding world in order to transform the one who uses it into mana. Gabriel was then surprised that Royd knew about it, since the servant kept it a secret, and it was unfinished. Royd then, as always when he said something he remembered from the novel, put on an innocent face in an attempt to deceive Gabriel, saying that he had heard the servant talk about her in his sleep. Gabriel looked at such a gentleman with disbelief, feeling a catch and thinking that he saw the iron mask of pretense on Royd's face only thanks to his rich imagination, since his master's words sounded logical and Royd really couldn't find out about the technique any other way. The servant replied that, unfortunately, he would not be able to teach this technique, and Royd himself finished for Gabriel, adding that the technique was not completed. Royd, with a sly expression on his face, asked the servant if he could complete it. Then Gabriel could teach him this technique. Gabriel agreed doubtfully, not believing that his self-confident master was really capable of such a thing. Royd firmly stabbed his sword into the ground, telling the servant to listen. The young master suggested that Gabriel's heart of mana absorbs mana from the outside on its own, showing on his fingers how mana from the outside comes to the heart of mana, which was symbolized by his clenched palm. Royd's fingers, indicating mana, bounced off the heart on the next movement, and the words explained that in the process of absorbing mana from the outside, the mana of the environment is foreign to the heart and internal energy of the knight. In order to solve this problem, Royd suggested that the knight change the source, and not mix the mana that he absorbed from the outside with his own, but let it collect separately, roll it into a separate cloth that could envelop his heart. Royd compared it to an auxiliary engine next to the main one, because then they would be one at the same time, but would work separately. Gabriel was amazed at this idea, since it was possible, but the servant did not understand how his master came up with such a thing. Royd needed to put on his iron mask of pretense again and act like he was a fool, surprised that such a crazy idea of his could work, while Gabriel felt the catch, internally indignant at why Royd was fooling him. Then, during training, Gabriel still managed to complete the Azrakan mind technique, which had bothered him for a long time because it remained unfinished. New circuits, clots of external mana or circuits, gradually increased, and with the help of training it was possible to create 3 of them, and if developed further, this number could increase to 4 or 5. A new notice sign then notified Royd that Gabriel's opinion had increased by 5 points. The time spent on those trainings was successful, although Royd was indignant that Gabriel taught him the whole technique, and not just the absorption part, when he could not take away the mana around him, but only the one he touched. Therefore, he was not surprised by the outcome of the duel between Royd and the knight Newman, but was impressed by how triumphantly his master did it. The Baron raised his voice again, shouting for his son to stop and stop further spoiling the knight's reputation. Royd froze again, stopping shamefully beating the knight with a shovel. He turned to his father, breathing heavily, and clarifying whether his father was really talking about the knight's reputation. The young master pointed to the table where his father was sitting and asked him to look under the tablecloth before the next time the Baron spoke about Knight Newman's reputation. The Baron lifted the tablecloth, surprised to find many envelopes. The man took the first one with surprise and bewilderment, reading the contents. Royd, seeing his father's confusion, explained to him and everyone present that this was a letter from Tords, who was causing harm to their estate, and this Tords was writing to the knight Newman. The Baron was shocked, because the letter contained information about the situation of the estate, what the Baron likes and dislikes, instructions on how to forge documents for property, and a lot of other valuable and confidential information. Knight Newman, who had barely come to his senses, was terrified, because he hid them in the walls so that no one would find them. Royd smiled triumphantly, because thanks to the novel, he knew where the scoundrel had his hiding places. And last night he sent Podong to fetch them. The Baron fell into his chair in shock and devastation. Royd watched his father, because he knew from the novel that he was a kind man, and now he would not allow Newman to be killed, since such a thing would cause a big fuss. The young master, however, remained resolute, mentally reasoning that a good ruler and a good ruler are 2 different things. Royd turned to his father, noticing that he was clearly concerned about how to get rid of such a vile person as Knight Newman, because he had a proposal, and the Baron interestedly clarified what thoughts his son had. The young master suggested putting a rat on Newman's head, which meant a type of punishment in which a person wounded by rats was expelled from the estate, and if his father did not agree, then Royd's second option was to demote him to an ordinary soldier, giving him a chance to atone for his sins. The crowd of spectators began to whisper incomprehensibly, not believing that the knight could really be punished with rats. The Baron was surprised and impressed by such options, because this was quite part of the type of punishment for minor offenses and even gave the traitor knight a chance for redemption, albeit with a warning of a more severe punishment. The third knight of the family, standing next to Gabriel, agreed that this was a wise decision, and such punishment would also serve as a warning to others. The Baron answered Royd with agreement, saying to do as he suggested. The young master asked the traitor if he had any objections, and Knight Newman replied that he agreed to such a punishment, and also thanked those around him for his mercy. Royd only looked at the apostate with contempt, thinking about what such mercy could turn into in the future. Remembering past situations, how often is it that when a king treats criminals kindly, they begin to atone for their sins for the forgiveness that is so mercifully given to them? Royd knew that this was not the case, and the criminal only thought that his merciful ruler had softened, because of this, becoming even greater villains, determined and strong-willed in an attempt to take advantage of such kindness. Even now, Knight Newman did not repent of what he had done, but mentally made villainous plans on how to take revenge for his humiliation. Royd mockingly remarked to the knight that such a joyful and sinister smile, although it pleases him, would be the last for the knight. Newman, who did not immediately understand what Royd said, began to sweat as he asked again. The young master gave the red growth seed to Podong. He threw the hamster high into the cloudless sky. The last look that Royd cast at Knight Newman was one of contempt and anger, because the young master believed that there was no way to ask for forgiveness. High in the sky, Podong saw a red growth seed, which began to act with lightning speed. The animal immediately began to increase in size many times high in the sky. The Royd family, both knights and everyone present, watched in horror and surprise at the unexpected event. As Podong, having increased in size, falls back to the ground like a huge beast, right on the traitor knight, while Royd hastily ran away to the side. Newman looked at the approaching Podong in shock, unable to budge. Podong, joyful as always, flew straight at the traitor with a direct hit. With a loud plop, the hamster landed on the field, following the will of his master, while Royd, at a safe distance, stood impassively with his back to what was happening. Podong hit the mark by doing as Royd suggested, the part where they placed a rat on the traitor's head. The young master raised his hand, triumphantly ordering to expel the traitor, because it was precisely the method he used that could forever solve the problem with the rotten man inside the estate. It was a serene day in the lands of Baron Frontera. Podong, increased in size, was intensely digging for something on one side. Then he dug, on the other hand, as usual, without being distracted or interrupted by anything. The hard-working hamster dug holes right in the center of the village, between the houses of the residents, and Royd and Gabriel watched his work. The servant asked what Podong was doing, and Royd replied that he was preparing to widen the road. The young master looked around with pleasure, noting that their humble workers had become brave craftsmen under his leadership. Royd remembered that in ancient times there was a city like Rome, and its people not only loved roads very much, but also built a better road system called the Alpine Way. The young master explained to the servant that this is exactly what they would do, stretching the first road from the Baron's house to the eastern slope. Gabriel didn't understand why the road had to be first, but Royd wasn't going to explain anything, advising him to just watch. The only thing he explained was that the popularity of their village would soon skyrocket. Gabriel wasn't so much concerned about this as he was about where Royd learned all this. The servant did not understand how such a stupid person in the past came up with the idea of building heating systems that no one had heard of before, and how he suddenly learned to summon something from the outside, which is very similar to high-level magic. Gabriel asked the question that really bothered him, clarifying whether Royd was truly their master. A red warning sign immediately appeared in front of the guy's face, telling John that he had been Royd all along, that the situation was dangerous, since Gabriel doubted him. Royd looked at his servant with slight fear, quickly thinking of how he could get out of this situation. Gabriel continued to look at the master, waiting for an answer to his question. John mentally calculated the options, remembering that when he read about Gabriel in the novel, he already knew that he was a capable guy and could easily guess that a stranger had taken possession of the Baron's body. And if Gabriel receives confirmation of this, he will definitely unsheath and draw his sword against him, John, because this knight is not to be trifled with. Only John was also not a failure, since he had thought about this before and expected such a situation, and for this he had a special skill, persistence. So Royd made a stupid expression on his face and said that he was just studying in secret from everyone, and asked Gabriel if this was really prohibited. The servant doubted that Royd was capable of studying in secret, because he drank all day long, but John was not so easily confused, and he continued to insist on his own, clarifying whether the servant was watching him 24 hours a day, because it was not so, and although the guy himself agrees that he used to be a real scoundrel, the servant knows nothing about what he was doing all this time. Gabriel had nothing to say in response, so the servant switched to the second question about how, then, the master copes with the skills of a caster, because many experienced magicians are not always able to call. Royd in response asked how Gabriel himself copes with mana so easily, because he is only over 20, and no one taught him this, which means his knight is simply a genius. But Gabriel said that he does not consider himself a genius. John had to make a stupid, persistent expression on his face again, insisting that if he, a simple idiot, could do this, then he was a genius, and Gabriel could also be a genius, and why shouldn't Royd suddenly become a brilliant spellcaster? Because this could also happen. Gabriel had nothing to say in response, as he was amazed at the verbosity and persistence of his young master. Royd used another special skill, fast talk, and again perseverance to end the conversation, simply turning away from the servant, since he had nothing to say, and leaving to do his business. He quickly walked away from the servant, fearing that it could come to that and he could understand that John was lying, but Royd had no choice but to calm himself down. Having reached the place of work, Royd asked the second knight remaining on the estate, Byron, to monitor the progress of the work while the young gentleman himself was away, and he told the gentleman not to worry, and all his orders would be carried out exactly. Royd rushed to the exit from the village when Gabriel caught up with him, informing him that he would go with him, because the knight's direct duty is to protect the young master, which did not surprise Royd. He only noticed that the servant said the obvious thing and of course should go with him. Gabriel clarified where they were going, and Royd replied that they were going to the same place on the trail of an unpaid debt, which didn't really explain anything to the servant, leaving him with questions, but Royd didn't say anything else. By sunset they had reached a small, remote town called Rudnia Estate. The place that interested them in this town was a hotel. This was the home of the rogue Rhodes, who was currently in the highest stage of despair and anger, emotionally pounding his fist on the table. This young man was Rhodes, who could not believe that he had lost all the money and exclaimed that he would make some villains pay. Rhodes's servant, a huge big guy with scars on his face, clarified that losing money was not the essence of gambling, since this is how his master himself earned money. The servant clarified that since such a thing had happened, if Rhodes was not able to pay for his services, he would leave him immediately. Such a statement frightened the already desperate guy, who immediately said that he could pay the servant and would give even more than usual, so he should stay next to him, to which the servant replied that his master should remember that he would leave him immediately same if you do not receive payment on time. Rhodes, in a dialogue with himself, reflecting on the future, noted that he could only make money by deceiving others, but now too many people wanted to settle scores with him, so he should have laid low. Suddenly, Royd opened the door with his foot, bursting into Rhodes' room. Of course, Rhodes was outraged by the stranger's behavior, asking what he allowed himself to do. He jumped up from his seat looking at the brazenly entered young man. Royd grinned, remembering that of course Rhodes didn't see him. He introduced himself as Royd Frontera, looking at the scammer in front of him with a contemptuous grin and asking whether it became clear to him who was in front of him. Rhodes was frightened, while his servant was absolutely calm, as if he was accustomed to such situations. The big guy only asked if he should deal with the stranger, but Rhodes shook his head in fear and said that they needed to get away while Royd was approaching. The servant immediately jumped towards the frightened Rhodes, picking him up under the stomach, and then he jumped out the window, breaking it and carrying them both out of the hotel building. They landed slowly in a deserted alley without any harm to their health. Only the servant of Rhodes did not expect that an ambush would await them there. Gabriel pulled the sword from its legs, leaning it against his shoulder to indicate his intentions. He swung his blade making a cutting motion and blocking the fugitive's path. Royd's servant began to slowly approach the fugitive, telling Rhodes' servant that they only needed his master, and if he gave him up and left, they would not touch him. Gabriel was mentally surprised that everything happened as his young master Royd had said. Rhodes and his servant tried to escape through the window, and Gabriel was waiting for them where his master ordered. However, Rhodes's personal guard was not at all intimidated by Gabriel's presence, calling him a petty upstart. The big man activated the dark mana in his hands, asking if Gabriel even knew how to use a sword. Royd, who was watching everything from the broken window of the hotel room, remembered that according to the plot of the novel, after the death of Baron Frontera, Gabriel was thirsty for revenge, and he fought with Rhodes's personal guard, who was a fraudster, whose trail the servant managed to attack. Royd knew that according to the story of the novel, this battle should be Gabriel's first fight with the dark magician, and according to the book, Gabriel had a hard time, since he had to resist the magic of gravity that the big man possessed. Royd grinned contentedly, remembering that this only happened in the novel. Now events were beginning to develop in a similar way, because the personal guard of the rogue Rhodes was also going to use gravity, having already sent a charge of dark mana to Gabriel. The junior knight of House Frontera took a blast of dark magic directly onto his sword. The foreign mana was not reflected, but began to spread across the blade to activate its power. A huge pink ball of dark magic engulfed the area around Gabriel. The scammer's guard watched with satisfaction as everything went according to his plan, reporting that everything was a foregone conclusion. He released his hand towards the enemy with an open palm to use dark magic. The big man clenched his hand into a fist, activating the spell, and saying that Gabriel was about to die. A powerful gravitational force fell on the knight of the Frontera house, pressing him into the paving stones of the road, but not knocking him down, since he took the blow quite calmly in a protective pose. Royd, noticing the disoriented expression on the rogue's servant's face, mentally noted that in the novel, when Gabriel fought him, he was just a simple weapons specialist. But the real Gabriel has long become several levels higher, because his mana heart has long been much stronger. Now his servant's mana heart has 3 rings of external mana, which gives him additional strength. Gabriel swung his sword with ease, deflecting the dark attack and dispelling the spell. He looked at his opponent questioningly, clarifying what exactly he wanted to use, and whether it was magic that controlled gravity. Amazed by his strength, the personal guard of the rogue Rhodes slowly became covered in a sweat of fear. Realizing what had happened, he simply soared up, fearfully running away from the scene of the fight and leaving his master without protection and support, to which Rhodes called him a bastard. Gabriel, meanwhile, was advancing on the swindler with a drawn blade, asking whether he knew what would happen if he deceived honest people. The servant pushed Rhodes to the ground so that he fell onto some barrels. Gabriel swung his sword, looming over Rhodes, saying that he would cut off his legs so that he could only crawl to court. The servant began to strike, about to carry out his plan, when the cry of the young master urged him to stop. Royd, who stood between him and Rhodes, shielded the terrified swindler from the knight's punishment. The young master began to shout that the servant was out of his mind, because if Rhodes ended up in court in this form, Gabriel would be punished. Struck by his master's determination, Gabriel froze, wondering what had just nearly happened. He looked at the angry and disheveled Royd, wondering if he had now also learned to show compassion for others. It was a quiet moonlit night over the Ridania estate. Frightened, Rhodes sat at the hotel table in his room, tied to a chair. Royd sat opposite with incomprehension, looking at the trembling swindler. The young master smiled and urged his interlocutor not to be so afraid. He noticed that when life is at stake, people tend to be greedy and will do anything, just give them a chance. But Rhodes did not really understand the meaning of these words and asked what he meant. Royd, with a sweet smile, continued to explain to the rogue that killing him by cutting off his head would be too cruel. And when Rhodes asked if this meant that Royd had forgiven him, the young master replied that yes, and he would take the rogue's secret to the grave. Then the latter, very surprised, the son of Baron Fronter himself, without ceasing to smile sweetly, asked whether Rhodes was grateful to him for this, and if so, why not return all the money to the swindler? Rhodes, feeling that no one was going to kill him right now, smiled affirmatively, confirming that he would return the money. But first Royd must forgive him. Royd was still smiling sweetly, agreeing that Rhodes would receive forgiveness, because forgiveness was the meaning of their existence. Such a phrase put Rhodes into a stupor and scared him again, because there had to be something else. Royd did not make his interlocutor suffer for long, informing him that he would have one more condition, and Rhodes, of course, agreed to everything, asking Royd to voice his condition, whatever it was. Royd Frontera with a sweet smile handed Rhodes the contract, saying that all their differences would be resolved as soon as the fraudster signed the contract. Rhodes looked at the paper, not understanding what kind of contract Royd was asking him to sign, and Frontera explained that it was a standard employment contract, and that he would even pay Rhodes. The bottom line was that Royd would withhold 80% of the scammer's salary to pay off the debt. Rhodes still didn't quite understand why this was beneficial for Royd and was waiting for a catch. This is what happened when Frontera reported that Rhodes could pay off his debt in 520 years. This news shocked the swindler, who had just begun to relax, because it meant lifelong slavery. Gabriel, watching what was happening and seeing his master's insidious smile, noted in shock that Royd did not come here to sympathize and forgive. Royd, grinning evilly, thought that he was not a fool to kill someone who owed him money, and he definitely wouldn't take such a rash step. In his mind, John planned to suck everything he could out of the scammer for the rest of his worthless life. Rhodes, meanwhile, came to his senses, indignantly asking why Royd was offering him such a slave contract, to which Frontera was not at all surprised, only noting how arrogantly the rogue spoke. Royd made a frightening expression on his face and said that because of such impudence, his conditions were cancelled, and since there was no way to force Rhodes to sign him, they would resolve the issue in court. The fraudster fell silent, and with tears of despair in his eyes he grabbed the pen and signed the paper. The next bright day they returned back to the Frontera estate. In the cart that the old man drove through the forest sat Royd, Gabriel and Rhodes. The scammer was still not himself, and Gabriel said that he had managed to make some money from him, which should be enough to pay interest for a couple of months, to which Royd replied that this money would not go towards the debt, but would go towards expenses related to the construction, since they have already gone through this and the 30 workers they have are not enough. The young gentleman was thinking hard about where to get more workers, remembering that they had advertised and worrying that no one had responded to it. The man associated this with problems due to his reputation. So a couple of days later, when they were already at the Frontera estate, he made the announcement again. An information sign for the villagers stated that the estate was in need of labor, and all workers would be paid a salary of 20 gold coins. This time, a whole line of local residents lined up at Royd's table. The young master was surprised by such an influx of people this time, asking Gabriel if people didn't hate him before, to which the servant said that everything was true, but something had changed. Gabriel noted that Royd undertook to install the heating system on time and at a low price, then punished the traitor to the estate and forced him to appear before the high court in front of everyone. The servant recalled that his master said that he would become a reliable person who could be trusted. Royd sat amazed and thought that just these little things were enough for people to start believing him. The first villager to approach the table clarified whether Mr. Frontera was indeed offering a job, and Royd confirmed that he was, and he needed the man's signature on the contract. The villager nodded in agreement, but said that before he signs, he would like to express his gratitude to the young master. The man said that his child catches a cold very easily as soon as it gets cold, but thanks to the young master and his system, this year this head of the family has nothing to worry about. The man bowed low in gratitude, expressing his gratitude to Royd. Confused by this attitude, Royd thought that he had not originally planned anything like this, making these systems just to satisfy his greed, but it turned out to be for the benefit of people. A village resident, meanwhile, said that he has relatives from the Racona estate, which is located not far from the Frontera lands, and the relatives would like to know if Royd could install his system there too. Such a request started a chain of thoughts in John's head that all his attempts and undertakings had finally yielded first results, and everything was not in vain, and now he could increase the cost, explaining this with travel expenses and get more money. Carefully hiding his satisfaction, Royd told the villager that of course he could, but he would need additional funds to deliver all the materials to the site, while Gabriel noted this strange expression of smugness on his master's face. The servant wondered if it could be that all this construction led to only one mercantile goal. Only Gabriel didn't understand then why to make that difficult road through the entire city. As the servant and master later stood on a hill overlooking the city below, Royd turned to Gabriel. He noted that sooner or later there would be nothing left on the mountain where they stood, and Gabriel asked with confusion what his master meant. Royd explained that the heating system requires a lot of resources, and soon all the trees in the area will be stumps. Gabriel, who understood what Royd was talking about, looked at him in shock. He asked if he understood this and knew the outcome, why he continued what he was doing, and Royd explained that this was why he was stopping the construction of the Alpine Road, and instead they will start mining coal, which means they will build a road to another place. Royd, with a smug and malicious laugh, joyfully informed the servant that the coal they would start mining would be sold at an inflated price, and the news of their system would reach large masses and people simply would not be able to resist such temptation. He noted that, of course, the residents of the village near the Frontera estate would receive a discount, but a very small one, and Gabriel noted in shock that this was dishonest and cruel. Royd, who was able to track the expression on the servant's face and understood what he was thinking about, clarified whether he really thought Royd was like that. The young master asked, in Gabriel's opinion, if he abandoned this idea, would their family then be able to pay off the debt for the estate? Gabriel didn't think about this, so he had absolutely nothing to answer. Having gathered his thoughts, the servant still said that he agreed with Royd and now they had no other choice. But Baron Frontera doesn't know about coal, and once he finds out, he won't just abandon his son's initiative. Gabriel recalled that others had already tried to mine it again and again, but it had ended badly, and Royd reported that yes, he knew that everything had collapsed due to the fragility of the subgrade. At the same time, young Mr. Frontera was confident that he would succeed. He was going to take advantage of the knowledge from his real world, and using modern excavation technology and the shield boring method, he was going to build a movable prefabricated metal structure that would ensure safe mining. Inspired by his thoughts, Royd raised the shovel up, indicating the path with its help and directing him forward to accomplish great things, while Gabriel followed him with his gaze, perplexedly wondering what the shield method of drilling was. This was a technology unknown to him, and the servant was going to see what this completely different master of his could now do. Podong had already dug a ditch for a road leading directly to the mountain, but the entrance to the mine was blocked with stones. Inside there were still unfilled and free tunnels. Well, they were busy with someone big and dangerous, having limbs and feeling great without the presence of people inside grief. Hundreds of inhabitants of the mountain heard people talking. It was a multitude of insects that inhabited the depths of the mountain, and they followed the sound and noise in search of food and those who disturbed their peace. Royd folded his hands in concentration, preparing to use his abilities. He opened his eyes and called upon the magic of this world, conjuring it to fulfill his will, recreating the pentagram of the spell in front of him with light. He sent a column of magical sparks upward, shouting the name of one of the richest areas of Seoul, in hopes of recreating a high-class apartment. The magic ray reached the very heavens, getting lost somewhere in the heights. Another star lit up in the sky as a sign that the spell might have worked. And then, in the place behind Royd, a multi-story modern house materialized from the very heavens. True, it was all in the guy's dreams, because he did not yet have such a skill, but he could immediately draw the correct drawings with a magic ray, which is what he did. This skill was intermediate design, and only at the first level, when Royd could only create an underground output plan. He leaned back in his chair with a tired sigh, saying that he would like to summon 100 immortal workers who would not have to be paid. The blue dialogue tablet immediately took offense, saying that if he doesn't like magic, he can draw by hand, and Royd returned to work, agreeing that he still liked this skill. The guy stands in front of the rubble of the future mine, remembering that for the incident with Newman he was able to get 639 RP, impressing the Baron, Baroness, Gabriel and other residents, and he invested all these points in pumping up the skills of basic measurement and design, which allowed him get his hands on the tenant capacity indicator and underground scanning. So he could figure out by looking at the mountain where to start digging. He used an available mid-dimensional skill, namely underground scanning, which made his eyes glow again. True, at this level, this skill only allowed him to look at a distance of 5 meters. But this would also allow him to find the right direction in the future. Returning home thoughtfully, the young gentleman thought that he had a problem with how to cut through everything in the shortest possible time, because an ordinary person could not do this, and people got tired quickly. Royd remembered that the hamster got sick during the construction of the road, and even if the hamster recovered, it would be dangerous to use it in the mine, because it was very large. Royd frowned resolutely, realizing that he had no other choice. The guy called up the auxiliary board and selected the option to randomly select a mystical creature, because for this you only needed 70 points, and he had 119. He sat down on the road, and neon clots of magic danced in front of him again, activating the summoning portal with a strange and unpleasant sound. Soon, someone's round pink head with a bow appeared from the magical portal, and then the creature looked out almost entirely, turning out to be a friendly and smiling animal. A cute caterpillar fell onto the road in front of Royd, landing right on his forehead. The animal quickly stood up and stared at Royd, saying that her name was Jean. The guy looked at the magical creature doubtfully, not understanding whether that machine was really a killer, or whether it even had poison, or maybe it would turn out to be harmless. But after thinking about it, he remembered that Podong also seemed harmless at first. Royd asked the caterpillar if it also increases in size by eating a sunflower seed, and if it has superpower, and it answered positively. Then the guy asked the magical animal to show what she could do. The caterpillar nodded happily and smiled, because she was glad to serve her master. A few weeks later, the entrance to the mine was transformed beyond recognition, and the road to it was completed, while work on the next steps was in full swing inside. At the first step, the caterpillar, which Royd named Belle, became a giant, devoured the ground and moved along the shield barrel. She turned out to have the first-level skill of digging up soil, and she did it by eating it. Royd, who was standing behind the bell, shouted to his servant to get ready, as the tail part of the caterpillar was actively shaking, because it also had the skill of working out the soil. Gabriel, sweaty from hard work, stood with his sword at the ready for what was to come. On the second step, the bell used her third skill, launching metal, and it was with this that she shot at the servant. In the third step, the greatest sword master Gabriel cut through the metal with his technique and strength. In the fourth step of building a reliable support, workers forged metal, which was then used to build supports in the mine. At the fifth step, Gabriel realized the harsh reality, wondering why a knight like him had to bother with the poop of a giant snake, which he believed to be Bluebell. Royd, not distracted by such trifles, shouted that everything was fine and it was worth moving on. Special workers using supports moved the shield barrel further. Royd breathed in with difficulty, realizing that due to the lack of oxygen he was dizzy, and the air was supplied to them through a special pipe, without which they would have suffocated long ago. Gabriel turned to his master with the words that it was time for him to rest, like other workers. Royd only got angry with the servant, because how could he go to rest, being responsible for everything here, and he should have monitored the progress of work, as those in charge usually did. The guy remembered how in Korea, where he worked, the bosses could only scratch their tongues, and he even encountered such unscrupulous assholes that they never visited the workplace. Royd himself never intended to become like this, and even swore that he would keep an eye on everything himself, again activating his ability, thanks to which his eyes glowed and he was again able to see through the rock. After analyzing the dark clots in the rock in front of him, the guy realized that he had finally seen coal. He shouted joyfully to cheer up his workers, saying that they were almost there and had very little time left. Royd thanked the shrunken Bluebell, because thanks to her they completed it 10 times faster. The young master addressed all the workers, calling them to their attention, and informing them that once they reached the coal seam, they would need to dismantle the wooden shield they were currently in and expand the space. Royd began to say that this was a rather dangerous undertaking, so everyone would need to be extremely careful, when the stone earth wall on the side of the shield where they were digging began to crumble. The guy turned around to understand what was happening, and at first there was nothing, but then part of the earth fell out again inside the shield, as if something was pushing it from somewhere in the depths, and this frightened the bell. Royd stared blankly at the rock, trying to understand what was happening. The ground cover in this place was strong and should not collapse, so he activated his soil monitoring skill to see what was hidden behind the visible layer. But what he saw was only a small hole a few meters away that simply wasn't there before. Royd was peering closely, trying to figure out where the hole came from, when the unexpected happened. A huge insect with its body made a tunnel in the place where they were digging, bursting into their wooden shield and scaring away those around them. It looked like a giant ant and immediately tried to attack Royd, who miraculously dodged. Gabriel immediately came to the rescue, taking out his sword, which he did not part with. With a lightning strike, he cut off part of the upper mandibles of the insect's jaws. It took Royd only a moment to come to his senses and grab his favorite tool, a shovel, which he immediately swung at the attacking monster. With one powerful blow, he pinned the insect's head to the ground, dealing with it. The ant was defeated and its blue liquid, replacing blood, was splattered on the floor. Royd looked at the defeated enemy in shock, noting that it was surprising that something appeared in front of him that had not been seen before in the novel and that he did not expect. And then he realized that he was too calm, because ants do not come alone, and when he raised his head to the passage through which the insect had made its way to them, he and Gabriel saw that there was a whole horde of insects there. They crawled along the walls, floor and ceiling of their own passage, to which Royd and his squad had dug. And now all these angry insects, subservient only to their womb, were ready to attack them, so Royd immediately shouted to his people to run to the exit. Gabriel selflessly began to deal with insects with his sword, which, thanks to his skills as a swordsman, he did very well. Royd, who was not behind in using a shovel, kept hoping that the ants would end, not understanding how many there were, hundreds, thousands, and what could happen if these hordes got out, because then all of them and the village would come to an end. The young master looked at the swordsman who fought tirelessly, thinking that Gabriel most likely would not be able to stop them all, since there was too little air in the mine. Royd turned to the fleeing people, assessing what they could do with the mine, and perhaps the explosion could destroy it, but this would not guarantee that the ants would not crawl out. Gabriel, who thought that his master was in a panic, managed to give him a hard, sobering slap in the face to bring him to his senses, and reminding him that now was not the time for hysterics. Royd, angry, yelled at Gabriel, because he was not panicking, but thinking, and then the servant advised him to think faster. The swordsman was at the limit of his capabilities and said that he would not be able to hold back the onslaught for long. Royd picked up the shovel again, thinking that he had 3 components, such as the ant tunnel, the coal, and the dungeons. The metaphorical light bulb of ideas in his head was in complete darkness. But then it flared up with the bright light of a new thought, and Royd had an epiphany. The young master tore the torch from its mount and called the servant. Royd informed the swordsman that they were going on the attack and they needed to move forward. Gabriel thought it sounded crazy, but he didn't back down, rushing to attack the monsters. The servant selflessly hacked away at the insects with his sword, mentally noting that while his master's idea sounded crazy, there might be a point to it. So both men, armed with a sword, a shovel and a torch, rushed to attack the huge insects. At this time, workers from the mine arrived at the Frontera estate, giving the Baron bad news. The Baron was shocked to hear about the mutant ants, and the first thing he did was ask where his son Royd was, having learned that all the workers had successfully evacuated. But Royd and Gabriel remained inside, and Knight Byron was about to seal the entrance to the mine. Baron Frontera rushed to the armor cabinet. The Baron quickly put on his armor and hurried the servant, as they had to hurry to get to the mine. Gabriel continued to chop insects at this time, which his sword did an excellent job of. The swordsman turned to the master and asked why they were still continuing to defend themselves and not attack. Royd waved a torch to scare away insects and ordered the swordsman to stop talking, since he was busy at that moment. The guys found themselves surrounded on all sides, and all that the son of Baron Fronter could think about was that the very situation in which they found themselves was very terrible. But the good thing was that the ants did not come out of their holes. Royd saw that his assistant was at the limit of his capabilities. At the same time, the guy himself did not plan to retreat, and in conditions of high temperature and lack of oxygen, he was going to dig as far down as possible, because he was sure that there had to be methane somewhere in this dungeon. Royd, fighting with insects, was sure that since there is coal here, which is the location of methanogens, then there must be layers of methane gas around, which are hidden near all the mineral veins. Royd only needed to find such a methane layer, and that would be enough to blow up these ants with the torch. The young master activated his soil analysis ability, looking around to find similar layers, and so his search was crowned with success. He discovered a layer of methane gas. Royd resolutely stuck the shovel into the ground. It was becoming more and more difficult to fight off the insects. He asked the swordsman to hold back the ants, as he himself began to dig. With complete dedication, young Mr. Frontera began to dig into the soil to get to what he needed. He had no opportunity to be distracted by insects, and one of the ants was about to attack. Gabriel, it would seem, did not see that his master was in danger, but the knight was not so simple. With a deft circular movement of his sword, he cut off the head of the impudent ant, while simultaneously killing another one on the other side. His next sword strike fell on the insects attacking from the opposite side. But then a terrible roar, shaking the walls, swept through the tunnel, disorienting the guys. A giant ant appeared in front of them, a queen who was many times more ferocious and dangerous than her subjects. Royd and Gabriel looked in shock at the hulk hanging over them, clearly not expecting such a turn. The queen lowered herself onto her forelimbs, preparing to attack the people. Royd turned to the servant with a question whether he could overcome her, to which the swordsman refused, and the young master encouraged the servant, because until he tried, he would not really know whether he could handle it or not. But Gabriel was adamant, saying that he knows that there are things he cannot do without even trying them. Nevertheless, the swordsman raised his weapon to prepare for the attack, clarifying with the master that they had no other choice, and they would still have to fight the queen. The ant queen angrily rushed to the attack, intending to end the lives of the insolent intruders. Gabriel activated his mana heart, intending to expend all his strength on this fight. He assumed a defensive posture, preparing for a clash with an obviously strong opponent. He was able to withstand the first powerful blow of the insect queen. The huge ant was surprised, as she planned to crush the man with one blow. Gabriel not only withstood her blow, but also tried to parry, using most of his strength, and he succeeded, as his power was enough to throw the queen back. Royd was digging furiously at this time, realizing that his servant would not last long, and he could not waste a minute. The fight between the swordsman and the ant queen continued, and Gabriel managed to repel her attacks, although it was not possible to cause any significant harm to her. Meanwhile, Royd was able to break through a methane vein with a shovel, as the sound of a light pop was heard at the site of the soil break, and then the whistle of released gas. Royd bent down, picking up the torch since it was still too early to explode, and shouted to the servant that it was time for them to run for the exit. He and Gabriel ran for their lives from the angry female. The master and servant ran back through the narrow tunnel dug by the insects, which was now littered with their corpses, in an attempt to get back to their mine. The guys tried to hide around the bend as quickly as possible, which could save their lives. Seeing the moment, Royd turned around, preparing to throw. He threw the torch with all his strength into the tunnel behind them, wishing the queen to eat this torch in order to use the fire to start an explosion that was supposed to destroy all the insects. The young master's blow was aimed, as it hit the queen exactly on the head, and the torch bounced off her covers, flying even further back. After bouncing a few more times, he ended up behind the insects. The queen had by now caught up with Royd and Gabriel, intending to kill them both. From the broken methane pocket, gas came out with more and more force, and now it reached the torch. From its flame, the gas caught fire, quickly spreading through the tunnel. And then there was an explosion, destroying everything in its path with its force. On the one hand, the blast wave reached the queen, destroying her, and barely touching Royd and Gabriel, who covered the master. On the other hand, the explosion went through the tunnel where the insects came from, and where they still remained, and there the fire also destroyed everything in its path, not giving anyone the opportunity to survive. Gabriel covered Royd with himself all this time, since the life of his master and his safety were above all else for the servant. Baron Frontera, who had reached the mine by this point, as well as the other workers, and Knight Baron could only hear the sound of the explosion and watch as the mine shook. Royd's father, worried about his son, tried to rush inside, but the knight held him back by force, worried about the safety of his master. Meanwhile, the flames inside the tunnel where Royd and Gabriel found themselves died down. The young gentleman was the first to come to his senses, having difficulty understanding what he was saying, because the explosion was very loud and his unprotected ears were the first to suffer. He turned around, looking at the defeated dead-end queen, half buried in stones, saying out loud that it seemed his plan had worked. Royd slowly looked around, noting that Gabriel, who had protected him, lay unconscious next to him. The guy picked up the bell, who was also unconscious, apologizing to the magical creature for the fact that because of him she was in such a bad state. After that, he raised his head up to see how they could get out, but he was disappointed, because the entrance in front of him was blocked with stones and they were trapped. Royd staggered to his feet when the sound of a notification caught his attention. A blue information sign called for his attention, because its message said that there was a lack of oxygen around. Royd knew this, so he activated his terrain analysis skill and his eyes glowed brightly green. He looked around, choosing the side in which he could start digging, because he needed to dig out as quickly as possible, and he had to dig more than 5 meters. An information sign appeared in front of the guy again, showing how little oxygen was left. Royd did not hesitate, since there was no other way out, and began to dig, for the sake of those who were trapped in the tunnel with him. Gabriel, who had barely come to his senses, barely raised his head to look at his master, and he heard him address him, Gabriel, and the bell. The servant looked at his master with a dull gaze, hearing how he was determined to do everything possible to get them out. Gabriel found it more and more difficult to hold and concentrate, but he still heard Royd say that both the servant and the magical creature were the property of their master, and he had no intention of abandoning them. The servant completely lost consciousness, losing touch with reality. A whole series of new signs appeared next to Royd while he was digging, reporting that the guy's mysterious assistant admired his desire not to abandon Gabriel, and also reported that the servant's opinion of his master had increased by 6 points. In addition, Royd was receiving 108 RP, and the total balance was now 157. The guy breathed heavily, watching this information, thinking about what it could give him. Meanwhile, his oxygen reading continued to drop faster and faster, and he realized that overall he had nothing left to lose. So he called his mysterious assistant, requesting a search for knowledge that could develop his skills. Slowly, the function Royd had chosen began to load. Just like last time, the blue scanning circle passed up and down through his body. The information tablets informed the guy that he had discovered knowledge such as absorbing ambient mana, processing mana absorption, and increasing mana absorption. The last tablet suggested that by combining these skills, he would be able to master the Azrakhan core technique. Royd thought that this was a great option in the current situation, because he had not stopped training since the fight with Newman, and now he would be able to develop his skill as he wanted. In the blue dialogue box, he agreed to the question of whether he would like to master this technique or not, and it cost only 15 RP. The blue light of his body transformation marked the discovery of a new skill, and the blue information plate announced that he already had a level 5 single ring. A small cloud of mana formed in the space with a soft sound. He gained momentum, accelerating in a circle, increasing his strength and creating a ring around him. This ring surrounded Royd's heart so that he realized that he could feel it. But unfortunately he does not have any mana in his heart, but he can feel the presence of the rings. The new information plaque reported that he had a 120% expansion in mana. Royd might start to get nervous, since one such ring was not enough for his plan, because if he were an ordinary person, even if he trained hard, he would not get results immediately. But he was not an ordinary person, and he had RP points, which allowed him to increase his level with the press of a button, and the next increase cost only 10 RP points, to which the guy, of course, agreed by clicking the increase skill button. Another wave of blue glow formed around the guy's body, and the information sign announced that his level had been raised to level 6. The new information board reported that his mana had been expanded by 125%. Royd brought up the level up window again and chose to increase it again. So he continued to increase his level of the Azrakhan core technique as long as he had the opportunity. But an empty information sign appeared in front of him, without a level up button. Royd felt that something in the cloud of mana surrounding his heart had changed, and from one ring it split into two. The new blue plaque explained that his Azrakhan core technique had now changed from a single ring to a double ring. A series of new windows reported that the mana expansion had occurred by 200%, but to increase the next level he needed 100 RP points, while he only had 7 left. Royd asked how things were now, since his number of rings was supposed to increase. 2 information signs informed him that 2 new skills were now available to him, one of which was Vitality, which made it possible not to feel tired for 10 minutes, but it could only be used once a day, and the second skill was a Burst of Energy, which allowing you to create an expansion of mana 3 times for 20 seconds, and which could also only be used once per day. Royd grabbed the shovel more comfortably and ordered forward. Having activated the first skill, Zivik, the guy felt discharges of energy throughout his body. Thanks to this skill, he quickly began to wield the shovel, clearing his path with unprecedented speed. The information sign announced the next level of oxygen depletion. Royd continued to use his soil analysis skill, hoping to see a way out and praying that one would show up. He prayed that he could finally see at least a small opening, because if only he could find even a small crack, they would have hope. Royd dug alone as if he were working with a whole team, and thanks to his skill, he did it very quickly. The new sign warning about oxygen levels was already critically read, but Royd was not distracted by such trifles, continuing to look ahead, and finally, his skill had a positive effect, and he saw a gap in the area where he was digging, and this hole could become his real exit. Royd put even more enthusiasm and effort into digging his way to the exit. After all, his comrades remained behind him, Belle and Gabriel, who were also still unconscious. Royd pushed even harder, putting all his strength into every movement. A new critical information sign showed that oxygen levels had dropped again. It occurred to the young master to tense up and put even more force into his every action. But this could not deceive the laws of life, since the next critical level information sign showed that there was no oxygen left at all. And Royd's skill in soil analysis made him understand that there were only 3 meters left to the saving gap. Only every skill and ability had a limit, and it seemed that Royd had already reached his maximum, as his body fell exhausted to his knees. His shovel, such an indispensable work tool, fell next to him with a loud thud. The information sign above the devastated guy showed that the lively skill had ceased to work. In a dark tunnel, where there was almost no air left, Gabriel and the Belle remained unconscious, and an exhausted Royd, sitting in a dug passage. But at that moment, the second skill was activated, the release of energy, and Royd grabbed his shovel. He had only 20 seconds to break through the rock to the saving gap. At the same time, 20 seconds expired too quickly, And Royd did not have time to dig to the crack, and he only had 30 centimeters left. The red information sign indicated that the oxygen level had completely depleted. In the tunnel at one end lay Gabriel and Belle, and at the other end lay an exhausted Royd. The young master lay in the darkness and silence, thinking that everything was over too quickly, that he, having become in this world the son of a noble man living in a remote area, dreamed only of a quiet life. And here he lies alone in a dark tunnel, in silence, preparing to die. The sudden sound of a blow made him open his eyes. Royd stood up, hearing some action and strange sounds being heard in the place where he was digging. A moment later, in the place where the young master did not have enough strength to break through the crack, Padong appeared. Royd was more than ever happy about his first magical companion, because he saved them from death. Padong, having broken through the last barrier, released air into the tunnel, which allowed Royd to regain his strength. The guy made an effort, climbing up with the help of a shovel, and encouraging himself with the words that the calm life of his son of the nobility, John, was still waiting. It was night outside the mine above the lands of Baron Frontera. The light of the torch illuminated the path of the search group in the mine. The remaining knight of the family warned the Baron to go further, because it was too dangerous. But he was against it, since he was going to go to the end, ordering his people to return. But then Royd's father saw something ahead, stopping and waiting until it was clear whether it was an enemy or a friend. Someone was walking down the shaft towards them, and from the outline it seemed that it was one person dragging another. It was Royd, carrying Gabriel on his shoulders, while information signs explained that using the exceptional skills that Royd had activated in extreme situations had helped him surpass the limits of human capabilities, and this special occasion, combined with Azrahan's core technique, had an effect on him, strong influence on him. Now Royd had access to the strength mode skill, which gave him the opportunity, even with severe exhaustion, to receive the effects of the remnants of Azrahan's core technique. Baron Frontera, barely seeing his son, threw the torch and rushed towards him. The young master, exhausted, managed to take a few more steps, and then he fell into his father's arms, completely losing consciousness and falling into unconsciousness. Too many events happened that night in the lands of Baron Frontera. In the morning, life in the village near the estate went on as usual. Several villagers were talking among themselves, discussing the latest news, according to which, people's opinion about the young master had changed, because before everyone thought he was an idiot, but recent events have proven that this is not the case. For example, one man said that his nephew was in the thick of things in the mine, and saw everything himself, and when the giant ants attacked, Royd's first thought was to save the workers, and the second resident said that he was surprised that these rumors were true. Other villagers were talking about how only Royd and Gabriel were left in the mine after the main workers were evacuated, and it was they who killed all the monsters, and then the young master carried Gabriel out on his shoulders. All the residents agreed that such a young gentleman was very different from the one they knew before. Meanwhile, at the Frontera estate in the young master's room, Gabriel sat by the bedside with an unconscious Royd. The man looked like he was sleeping, but maybe he was. After a few moments, Royd opened his eyes, slowly coming to his senses. Gabriel immediately noticed his master's awakening. A blue information sign immediately appeared in front of the son of Baron Frontier, informing him that the inhabitants of the estate were deeply amazed by his heroic actions, and could not stop praising him. Royd read this information slowly, as he was just beginning to realize what had happened. However, the next information signs announced that he would be rewarded with additional RP points for his outstanding achievements, and now his score had increased from 7 points to 507 RP points. It took Royd a moment to realize what this meant, and when he realized that he had become a hero in the village, his face broke into a satisfied smile, because it was cool to get 500 RP. After the victory over the insects, work in the mine continued with renewed vigor. Village workers continued to strengthen the walls and work on the soil, and they were all amazed at who had joined them again. It was young Master Royd, accompanied by his servant Gabriel, who were going to work in the mine again. All the workers were happy to greet their master and express their respect and gratitude to him, praising him for his work. There was no one who did not admire Royd among the workers, and they all considered him their savior, and were sure that he was different from other nobles, showing a true example of nobility. The son of Baron Fronter himself did not expect such a warm reception for his return, which even made him feel slightly awkward. After all, 2 weeks had already passed since the incident with the ants, and work in the stone mine was in full swing, and everything seemed fine. Only Royd did not feel the same calm, and thought about the safety of people, trying to figure out how he could avoid even the slightest danger. He and Gabriel walked through the tunnel in search of ant trails, and Gabriel asked his master about the opportunity to ask a question, to which he agreed, but hurried him to ask quickly and not waste oxygen. The servant clarified why his young master always put himself in danger, because he could simply order others to do something for himself. Gabriel doubted that Royd would care about the safety of the common workers, and the servant reminded Royd that he was the future heir to the estate. But Royd interrupted him. The young master angrily called the servant a fool, not allowing him to continue. He was serious, so he continued, saying that he must bear responsibility for all possible risks. Gabriel stared at his master in disbelief, as it was unexpected to hear such a thing. Then Royd turned around with a crazy smile, telling him in stark contrast that if he did this, no one would say a word against him in a situation where he got rich and started throwing money around. The servant couldn't decide whether he thought the master's response was good or bad, and the information sign told Royd that Gabriel's sympathy level was about to increase. But suddenly he changed his mind. The guys reached a dead end, and Gabriel suggested looking elsewhere, but Royd refused and told him to wait. He activated his ability to see the soil and looked at the dead end again, reporting that it seemed to him that it was a hollow space. Gabriel asked if his young master wanted to see this for himself, and Royd began wielding a shovel, loudly reasoning that the queen could have laid her eggs here, and if offspring hatched from them, they would be unlucky. There was indeed an empty space behind the dead end, and very quickly Royd was able to dig another passage, examining the surroundings. A large green orc, entangled in a cocoon, was in the center of the room with a large number of equally entangled animals in cocoons. It seems that this place was an ant food warehouse that the guys stumbled upon by chance. Gabriel immediately grabbed his sword, intending to deal with the orc, as he considered him dangerous. But Royd stopped the servant, reporting that, to his surprise, it was now he who was acting recklessly. Royd, who had not encountered information about green creatures in the novel, asked Gabriel who it was, and he explained that he was an orc. They came closer to the greenskin, and Royd brought a torch to the orc to understand what was wrong with him, asking whether he was dead, to which Gabriel replied that most likely not, since he had heard that ants prefer to store their prey after first paralyzing it. Royd grinned ominously at this, anticipating how he could use such an amazing find. The young master smiled maliciously as he made his plans for the orc, considering it incredible luck. The orc was taken to the Frontera estate so that he could recover. Later, he said that his name was Garash, and now Royd was his savior, whose act the orc would never forget. John, in Royd's body, still couldn't understand why the orc added the word kick in his speech, but when he asked if he did it on purpose to better suit his character, Hirosh didn't understand him. Hirosh turned out to be the son of the leader of the orc tribe, and thanks to the care of the Frontera family's doctor, he quickly came to his senses. So now he was grateful to Royd for saving him, and said that he was ready to give him everything his savior wanted. Royd was waiting for this moment, pretending that he was just happy for the orc, but in fact he was waiting for this very moment. After all, he saved Hirosh, among other things, so that he could later use him for his own purposes. Therefore, Royd's request to the rescued one was to gather 120 orcs to help in the mines. But Hirosh responded with a confident refusal of such a request. Royd immediately grimaced, losing all his complacent appearance, because he was counting on a different answer. However, the young Baron Frontera was not used to refusals, so again smiling cordially, he asked Hirosh what was the reason for his refusal, and although Hirosh noticed his pretense and caught him at it, telling him that Royd looked like a bad person, the Baron's son got out of it, reporting that his tongue clicking is the same habit as the orc's desire to say kick every time in his phrase. Hirosh rose from the bed on which he was sitting, immediately noticeably towering over those around him, and said that orcs are warriors, and warriors follow the orders of the commander, and pointed to himself. The orc explained that Royd was not a warrior, and therefore he would not be able to order the orcs, and Royd, hearing this, realized what the problem was. By that time, the young master had already learned more about the orcs, so he heard that upon reaching adulthood, they should go into the wild and bring the head of a giant ant. But Hirosh made a mistake, and when he went to the lair as an ant, they immediately immobilized him. And then a cunning plan arose in Royd's head to use this to his advantage. He began to smile sweetly again, pretending that he was not at all upset by what he heard, and then congratulated Hiroshi on coming of age. Only the orc was saddened by these words, not happy, and he informed his savior that he had failed his task and did not catch the giant ant, because he could not move, which means he lost. And then Royd resorted to a trick. The young master pointed to the head of a huge insect hanging on the wall, and asked Hiroshi if he and Royd had caught it. The big orc honestly answered that no, and he did not remember that he had managed to catch such a huge ant. But Royd immediately began to convince him otherwise, saying that Hiroshi was simply passed out and therefore did not remember anything. Royd again used his special facial expression to deceive, and placing his hand on Hiroshi's shoulder, began to talk about how he had witnessed a truly impressive sight, since when he reached the lair, he saw the queen ant shaking in fear. The young master continued, reporting that she was squealing in fear, screaming that she did not believe that she had lost to the young orc. And when Hiroshi began to doubt that the ant monsters could talk, Royd assured the interlocutor that yes, insects were quite successful in such a thing. Gabriel, listening to this outright lie, was only surprised at how Royd continued to thank the orc for making it easier for them to find the insect's lair. Royd continued to chatter the orc, convincing him of his undeniable victory over the insects, and in the end, he managed to deceive Hiroshi, so that he believed that he had defeated the ants together with the young master. Royd continued to praise him, convincing him that the young orc was an unrivaled warrior, just like Royd, and under such an attack, the orc began to doubt his version of events. Therefore, Royd recalled his request with 120 orcs, and Hiroshi, who believed in the version of the young Baron Frontera, reported that 120 warriors would arrive for Royd. A week later, the delegation from the Frontera estate was far from home. After a long journey, they reached the village of the Steel Sand Orc tribe. Only their long journey in search of labor ended with the great leader of the tribe saying that he was very sorry, but they could not fulfill the request of the man Royd. To say that the young master was upset and disappointed is to convey only a small part of his condition. Royd turned to the great leader of the Steel Sand tribe, Akush, with a request to find out the reason for the refusal. The chief reported that the orcs were not strong enough to complete such a task, since they needed to eat meat to maintain their strength, and if they did not hunt, their muscles would weaken, and the loss of their strength will lead to the fall of the tribe, and they cannot currently reduce the number of warriors they need for hunting. To which Royd asked with surprise, "Do orcs have to hunt every day?" Chief Akush replied in the affirmative, because if they did not hunt every day, they would not eat meat and their muscles would weaken. Royd was disappointed that the orcs turned out to be stupid. In addition, Gabriel confirmed that proteins were the meaning of their life, and his young master had better give up his idea. But the son of Baron Frontera only said that he heard the leader, making it clear that he had his own thoughts on this matter. He made an excellent proposal to the leader, specifying that if he solved the problem with meat and it would not spoil for several days, and the orcs would not have to constantly hunt, the leader could lend his workers in exchange. Orc Akush nodded affirmatively, indicating that yes, since the orcs wanted to repay Royd's debt, while still worrying about their strength. The young master again clarified whether the leader confirmed that if the problem with meat was solved, he would like to get soldiers for himself, because he had an idea to give the orcs a way to keep their meat fresh for a while.